Okay, thank you and welcome everybody to today's meeting of City York Council's Audit and Governance Committee. My name's Councillor Hollier. I'm chairing the committee this evening. You'll see down sort of both sides, we've got the rest of the committee, and at the sort of end of this table, I'm joined by Bryn Roberts, who's the Council's Director of Governance, and Debbie Mitchell, who's the Council's Director of Finance. Also joined by Robert Flintoff, who's our Council's Democracy Officer. And they're basically here to keep us on the straight and narrow, make sure we don't do anything too crazy. Are there any apologies for absence? I think we've just got them from Miles Binney, who's our independent person, and Councillor Cole's substituted by Councillor Whitcroft. So welcome this evening. Any declarations of interest? No. Move. Well,
sorry, can I just make a note in terms of the scrutiny protocol? I obviously had some involvement in the production of that as Vice Chair of Corporate Scrutiny. So I'll just record that. I've talked to Bryn about it. I don't need to declare a prejudicial interest.
No, thank you. Minutes and action log then. I think we've got two sets of minutes. One the 14th of May, which we made a amendment to at the last meeting. So are we happy with that now? I think so. Yep. And 30th of July. Yeah.
I've got a few points on both, if that's all right. The page 7, paragraph 76 in the first set of minutes is missing a couple of words. It should say emergency planning or local resilience be discussed. And so the sentence doesn't quite make sense. And then page 8, para 78 says the committee noted that it had asked whether there was a place for the committee to be involved in the review of scrutiny, but it then doesn't minute the answer that was given at the meeting, which I think would be worth including in the minutes if possible. And then I've got some on the second set of minutes, if that's
okay. I think, yeah, if we just make those minor amendments, I'm sure I can sign those otherwise. And second set.
Page 17, item 9 says, asked if the statement could include reference to the ward boundary review taking place. But the point that was being made there was actually the ward boundary review this financial year, not last financial year. So wouldn't make sense to include in the annual report. It was specifically the various CGR discussions over the last year that there was no reference to that should have been added. The resolution 2 is also incorrect. It also references it as a ward boundary review, but that was the bit that shouldn't be included because it's not from that period of annual statement. Page 20, item 15, the resolution has a missing word in it, but actually I think it doesn't match what's said on page 23 in the action plan. It says to ask it, I think it should say to ask it to review the council's developing communication strategy rather than just making it available to the committee. And since that matches what's in the action plan, I think that's already kind of, it's just a way of phrasing that issue, I think. And then I've got some action log item things as well.
Okay. I think I'm sure we're happy with those relatively minor amendments. We could make those and can either bring them back next meeting or just sign them.
If I can, Chair, my suggestion would be that if members are comfortable with those, then they agree that subject to those being made, you can sign them outside of the meeting.
Yeah. Okay, happy with that. Action log, Councillor Rose.
Item 68 around the Salvation Army contract says it's going to be completed in July 2025, but it's still marked as incomplete. I don't know if there's an updated action or timeline on that or if I've misunderstood it. And then I've got two other actions. Action 83 says May 2025 and incomplete. So same question for that. And then action 94 is marked on the completed list on page 34, but I can't tell what makes it completed based on the description provided against it. So I don't know if 68, 83 and 94, there's an update that can be given today, or if that can be resolved in line or.
If I can assist, certainly in relation to item 68, the report is being finalised as we speak, so it will be at the next.
It just needs an updated end date then, and is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would anticipate it will land in your inboxes sometime in the next couple of weeks in advance of presentation at the next meeting.
Great, thanks.
83.
Yeah. 83 is it's the one about all of the honorary aldermen and alderwomen being informed annually, and it says that once annual council has taken place, they'll be notified immediately and it'll be removed from the action list. and then it's
still on the action list.
still in the action list.
So I think we can remove that. We can confirm that that was done.
Assuming that was done, that's
Yes,
my question. Assuming that's done. I think
Robert
it
has
should be.
confirmed that that was
That's
done,
complete.
so we can remove that, and that will simply become part of the protocol going forward.
And then 94 is the explore the possibility of a member working group for best practices from all other local authorities for audit and governance committees. And the action says that you'll consider the options available and present a report, but it's on our completed actions list, which I believe hasn't yet been completed.
I am struggling to find it.
It's on page 34. It's at the very bottom end of the bottom list of action plan.
Yeah, I can include. I'll put that on. I can include that in the future update, Chair. So if you want that back on the to-do
If
list.
it's okay to leave that until it's come to committee, that'd be ideal for me, if people are happy.
Okay. Any other issues to raise, Councillor Merritt?
Yes, could I raise 84 and 85 from last November, where we're looking to Verito to come back, our internal audit to come back on those two items. It just says ongoing. We've got no dates, nothing. I wonder if we could ask Verito if we can get a clear timeline for those two.
So given that Verito are attending the next meeting, I can ask them to include an update as part of that.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Can't see are there any issues, so happy to move on. Right, so move on then to public participation. So we've got 5 speakers this evening, and we're starting with Councillor Vassy. Would like to join us in the middle, please? I'll just say each public speaker's got 3 minutes to address the committee, and I'll give you a warning about 30 seconds. But I'd like to make a start in your own time.
Thank you. The proposed scrapping of Planning B Committee and the other changes in this report present an erosion of democracy and a further concentration of power in the hands of unelected officials. Like many of you, I serve on planning committees. I know the importance of having elected councillors involved in decision making to ensure that our residents and our city's values are fairly represented. 4 examples. 1. In July, an elected councillor called in an application related to a listing building on Museum Street. The council's planning officers were set to refuse the application on conservation grounds, despite the fact that neither the Civic Trust, nor the York Conservation Trust, nor the York Conservation Advisory Panel wished to see the application refused. In fact, no one opposed the proposal, except officers. If the application had not been called in, there would be no new jobs and an old building would be standing empty. For what? 2. Oglethorpe. Planners sought to oblige the Minster to revisit the conversion of an old industrial building and change all the windows on the ground that an officer considered the windows looked like UPVC and were out of keeping with the rest of the street. In fact, all the buildings in the street have different windows, and the offending windows were not PVC. Instead of being supported for its commitment to climate change, cutting carbon emissions and creating new homes in old buildings, something the council's own strategy supports, the Minster authorities were attacked by our own planning department. Planning B corrected that. Domestic extensions. Over 6 years, I've repeatedly called in applications recommended for refusal by planning officers on the grounds of alleged impact on the green belt. Villages like Neyburn, where residents are effectively banned from building extensions, forcing couples with young families to leave, even though they live on streets where 70% of the properties have extensions. 3 years ago, the village school nearly closed because of falling pupil numbers. Planning committees protected residents and communities. Section 106 agreements. The proposals recommend scrapping a committee consideration of planning applications for fewer than 40 homes. As everyone here knows, This council has been roundly criticised in an internal report for multiple failings in the way that Section 106 agreements are calculated, determined and spent. Millions of pounds intended to offset harm from new developments are sitting unspent in the bank. Does anyone imagine that delegating all applications fewer than 40 homes to officers will improve that situation? Lastly, does anyone imagine that allowing officers to vary and remove conditions as they see fit will protect the interests of local residents, communities and our city? We all want an effective planning system. Removing democratic oversight won't help. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we've got Mr. Kevin Holland.
Excuse me, Chair. Sorry, I wasn't planning on asking a question, but just to make sure, will committee members have the opportunity to ask questions if they so indicate after a member of the public has spoken?
There's no opportunity to ask questions to the members of the public, but you will get opportunities to ask questions to the officers when we get to that item. Okay, yeah, if you'd like to make a start in your own time, thank you.
I have significant concerns about agenda item 7, which by the way is incorrectly dated 3rd of September 2024 on page 101 of the public pack, about how the constitutional changes to the planning committees have been presented to you. My own personal views on the government's proposed changes to planning are irrelevant to my concerns. This is about governance. A fundamental part of your role in this committee is that you only vote in favour of constitutional changes, which these are, after considering the facts and the pros and cons. Decisions should not be based on conjecture and should definitely not be influenced by party lines. In my view, you do not have enough facts in front of you to be able to approve the proposed changes, and you have a duty of care to reject them outright. Here are my reasons. Good governance practice for properly considering changes includes provision of documents marked up with proposed changes, with supporting data, a recommendation and reasons. The monitoring officer has failed to provide any of these. In stark contrast with agenda item 8 on scrutiny changes, which does have all those, these omissions alone should be sufficient for this meeting to reject the proposal. The proposal includes on page 165 chief planners' criteria and guidance with items that would never ever be called into planning committee. These are not in the current constitution, so why are they being introduced now? The list includes surprising delegated approvals, including never calling in demolition in a conservation area, never calling in listed building consent and other heritage assets, and never calling in variation removal of conditions. No rationale has been provided for any of these. Have the relevant heritage bodies been consulted? Another concern which by itself should warrant rejecting this proposal. The monitoring officer has not said what issue caused them to initiate this proposal. Your terms of reference say that you will consider issues brought to you by the monitoring officer. Ideas from government are not a mandate. So what is the issue? The national requirements for planning approvals haven't changed yet. The planning bills currently going through the House of Lords contains no details. Feedback on the latest government technical consultation is currently being analysed to inform a consultation later in the year. The latest view from the government in that paper proposed delegating authority for up to 9 dwellings and floats the idea of 3 tiers with a mid-tier for 10 to 50 dwellings. Yet your monitoring officer has proposed delegating authority for any development under 40 dwellings and only 2 tiers. It says 40 in the paper.
Sorry, I mean, you've got 30 seconds left.
Sorry. Clear conflict with the government's latest proposals. Why? Must be explained. Why are these changes being proposed now? You need to find out to avoid accusations of hidden agendas. Second guessing the mandate will be disruptive and need change in the future. Serious issues, no clear driver for changes why these should be made in advance of government mandate. I urge you to ignore party lines and reject this proposal based on governance reasons and report to full council that changes should be delayed until any new national policies have been set by government.
Thank you very much. We'll take your comments on board when we get to that item.
Thank you.
Okay, we can move on then to Mr. Johnny Hayes. Would you like to join us?
Thanks very much for letting me speak. I'm here as a member of the public first and foremost, but also as a former councillor and a local shopkeeper, just to add to the mix. To be honest, I'm somebody that's been very much involved in planning over many years, and have been involved in an awful lot of planning decisions, many of them very contentious, and many of them that have been called in. And as far as I've been concerned, that right to have a call in with a ward councillor has always been a very important relationship. Whereas this proposal seems to be cancelling out the automatic right for ward councillors to be able to call in contentious applications. I feel that this set of proposals, which is terribly thin, when it's looked at, it's vague. It appears that this is just a proposal that is being considered. It's not yet concluded upon. Yet the item is asking councillors to actually come up with conclusions on a change to the constitution, and those changes are frankly draconian. It is quite shocking to be precise. It was pointed out to me that this is what was going on, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, this can't be true, but it is. So I feel that it's very important that this decision, at very least, should be deferred, that there ought to be a working party to look into this, because of the fact that we're moving in a direction away from the long-held principle of officers advise and councillors decide. But under this set of circumstances, those decision processes are being completely lost to local councillors, and it would appear that officers are making decisions which are often flawed, which was illustrated by one of the previous speakers about the bookshop that was referred to, which was a particularly good example. So I feel that this really, the brakes should be put on, because the recommendations that you have in front of you really don't give you very much of an opportunity to look at this. And frankly, I can't believe that you've been asked to make some decisions on the basis of this very thin item. I feel that you would need significantly more time to come up with an answer, and that answer ought to be, as most planning decisions are, with the public in mind. Yet the public, I feel, are actually being sidelined on this, and the public are being, thank you, and the public are being pushed very much to the back. And I'm very worried about it, and hope that you decide at least to defer, and hopefully to come up with a cross-party approach, which would be lovely to see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If you can move on then to Andy de Gorn.
Thank you, Chair. Devolution was supposed to bring greater local involvement in decisions, enabling us to take back control. This government and council, however, seem intent on creating a developer's charter, sidelining any influence of residents and their councillors on most planning decisions. As someone with 20 years' experience on York's planning committees, I can say that these proposed changes are the most far-reaching yet in terms of removing the influence of residents and their ward councillors over decisions that will impact lives and our unique city for decades to come. In my experience, many decisions that are now proposed to be decided by officers behind closed doors have in the past been significantly changed for the better through the power of calling, as Councillor Vassie referred to. As an example, with decisions then made following public speaking and committee debate. Councillors are far more likely to be in touch with residents' views in weighing up the planning balance of public benefit against heritage or other harms. These proposals will, in applications for demolition in conservation areas, listed building consent, tree preservation orders and several others, exclude the opportunity for the views of the York Civic Trust and other authoritative local bodies to be aired publicly and debated prior to a decision being made. A big loss for democratic scrutiny and accountability in this city. While the planning legislation is passing through Parliament, it seems these changes would preempt the final outcome of scrutiny by MPs, including our own. Surely we should wait to see what is actually required. The government's portrayal of the need to speed up planning processes as an obstacle to house building is in any case flawed. Much needed affordable housing provision will not be increased by allowing developers to skimp on details. Any fast-track process for smaller sites increases the risk of badly designed new housing that fail to respond to local circumstances and without appropriate contribution towards vital infrastructure such as safe cycling and walking, outdoor play space and many other Section 106 elements. All the changes set out here reduce transparency of decisions, play into the hands of right-wing voices and reinforce the existing perception of a council that doesn't listen to local residents. Your Green Party strongly urges a rethink on the whole of this proposal that will cut out public engagement in and council input to most local planning decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Karim Lalani.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
So on behalf of Fulford Parish Council, we do have significant concerns about what's been discussed this evening, especially in Annex 2, which the measures do appear overly restrictive and unclear. So the list of applications excluded from potential call-ins is, in our view, far too wide. The exclusion of all applications for listed building consent and other heritage consents is very troubling. As a city, we're obviously known for our heritage, and to prevent call-in requests on such applications would exclude the democratic oversight that helps protect these assets. Quite astonishing to see that the ability to call in applications for demolitions in conservation areas will be taken away. Many concerns about the blanket exclusion of Section 73 applications. And of course, while it's right that some of these variations can be determined by officers, there will be inevitably occasions where proposed changes are substantial and deserve full scrutiny by the Planning Committee. Including a separate category of applications to vary or remove conditions introduces unnecessary duplication because these applications are in effect also Section 73 applications. Moving on to public participation, Annex 2 proposes a maximum of 3 speakers for and 3 against any application, with slots allocated on a first come, first served basis. If a particular planning committee has a long agenda, then the number of speakers could be reduced even further. Of course, there has to be certain limitations, but within those limitations, we would ask that parish councils be guaranteed the right to speak, in addition to the right of ward councillors. Parish councils, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, are a vital voice for local communities, and it would be unfair, it would be undemocratic if that voice could be excluded simply because speaking slots had already been filled. So to summarise, we would ask that Annex 2 is reconsidered. The reasons for this is heritage protections must not be weakened. Scrutiny of major variations must remain possible, and parish councils must be assured the right to represent their communities in the planning process. And a further point that was made to me earlier, and it's what I've been thinking personally of, why is the, and I think it was mentioned by a previous speaker, why is the council bringing these changes forward now before the national scheme of delegation is even published? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. So thank you then to all of our speakers, and obviously we'll take all those comments on board when we get to that item on the agenda. And we've got a couple of items before then, but you're very welcome to stay, and hopefully we won't be too long. But yeah, if we can move on then to item 5, which is the Audit and Governance Key Corporate Risks Monitor 2. Thank you. And if just for the record, if you could sort of state your names and job titles.
Sorry, I'm David Walker. I'm Head of Customer Finance, Risk and Insurance. So I'd like to introduce Risk Monitor 2 to you, Chair. The purpose of the paper is to update A&G members on the key corporate risks and provide assurance on their management. Going through the report, I'd like to draw your attention to paragraph 10. At the last meeting of A&G in July, members asked for the capital programme to be brought forward, and that will now replace KCR 5 safeguarding at Monitor 3. So I'll bring that risk along at Monitor 3, which will be in January. There was also a debate around whether subsequent risk arising from the implementation of the local plan gives rise to further new risks or KCRs. Again, will be debated by officers and brought back at Monitor 3. Annex B provides a summary of the KCRs. There's been no substantial changes in terms of the overall risk profile on the KCRs. Paragraph 16, there's a set of updates since the last monitor. KCR 1, financial pressures, we've added a new action there around the fair funding review. In terms of changing demographics, again, there's been a review of the risk and there's a further review of the risk being done, and also the implications and controls of the addition of a owner responsible for data analysis. And of course, KCR 4 is the risk that we're looking at in detail this evening, which Sarah's here to talk through. KCR 6, health and wellbeing, there's been some changes around that risk in terms of new additional risk details around infectious disease outbreaks and rising cost of living, and about demand for early intervention and prevention. A little change on implications. They've removed one of the ones around sexual health service. Just to confirm, the reason that was taken out was the risk was originally in there because it was part of a procurement process. The procurement is now completed, so far there's no reason for that implication to remain in there. KCR 10, workforce capacity, we've removed one of the actions there, which was around the implementation of the 24-25 pay award. That was delivered in August, backdated to April 25. But there is a new risk in KCR 10. This is around the review of the NJC pay spine and the national living wage. Obviously, as that raises, it puts pressure on compressing our own grading structure. And it also has an impact on competitive market rates. So that's the change to that risk. As agreed, we're going through KCR 4 tonight. You call forward the risk on the capital programme. I've also had a request to bring forward KCR 12, which is the risk relating to major incidents, and whether it's not in the report because it was asked for me after the report had been written. This is the risk that relates to failure to respond to major incidents. It's issues around fire, pandemic, climate change, being a topical issue at the minute. They did want to bring their risk forward. The current progress that they're doing this would not be coming until 2027. So as an additional request, I would like to bring that forward. Just back to the recommendation. So to consider and comment on the key corporate risk ledgers are included at Annex A. Note and provide feedback on the in-depth review, which we've not done yet, and any of the feedback on either the KCR 4 that we're going to look at or anything I've said with regards to this report, Monitor 2. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just ask the committee then if there are any questions on the report up to the sort of annex about KCR 4, if we sort of come to that separately. Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just on that final one around KCR 12, obviously the circumstances related to public unrest and disorder have arguably heightened significantly, particularly over the last summer and this summer as well. I was wondering whether those instances have been taken into account specifically for York and what kind of impact that's had on our risk rating around major incidents.
Well, the actual risk owner would monitor that risk and change the risk before it comes. So what's in there is the latest version of that risk, which is why we bring risk owners in to explain it, because I'm not an expert in that area. And I think it's not just that, but that's a good issue in terms of what's driving them to request to come earlier, because there's a lot of activity around some of the National Resilience Forum risks around both that and climate change and fire. And I just feel that they would like to come and go through this with you, which is why they've asked to bring it forward.
Okay, any further questions, Councillor Rose?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, and noting the point you've made around KCR 8 still being absent around any potential planning risk. I think risks are about hypotheticals, not just certainties, right? And from that perspective, I think having the action about the fair funding review, but not increasing KCR 1's financial risk is something I think that should be re-looked at. We don't know what the outcome of the consultation could be, but it could be significantly worse for York, and therefore, as a risk, that risk persists until we know what the outcome is. In my opinion, I'm quite surprised about KCR 7, which is the capital program one, being net impact moderate. We've obviously seen a number of things around finances and timeframes in major projects. And one of those was, a £100 million extra valuation of the cost of a project. So it is definitely mitigated a lot more through the various things that we do about it. But I do wonder whether net impact should be major rather than moderate on that one, especially compared to the one underneath, which is the communities one, which for me feels like a lower potential impact on council functionality than that. KCL 12 you mentioned around the climate change impact. I was just wondering whether it would benefit to have a specific reference on here to droughts, which isn't mentioned at the moment. It mentions climate change, but given the impact of this year's drought, I wonder if it might be worth bringing in, and I'd certainly back bringing forward the report on that one for greater conversation within this year. And just so I don't have to say anything when we get onto the annex, it's really appreciated seeing the detail on the KCR 4, and I've got no comments on it. I didn't last time, but I forgot to say it's because the report's really good. So just wanted to call that out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any comment, I guess, particularly on the point on the capital programme?
Yeah, no, fair comment, fair point. I'll take that into account on my next review. I don't quite agree, but I will consider it and we'll review it in terms of next time. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I share your concerns about KCR 1. The rumours coming out that we're getting about the financial redistribution of wealth and the way that it will affect this council concern me greatly. I mean, for the last many years, I think our finance team have been like the boy at the dike, sticking the finger in all the holes. But I think very soon it could be that Debbie's going to have to take on the attributes of Vishnu with 8 arms, so having enough fingers to plug them all. I think we're facing serious problems. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and we need to keep that risk very, very carefully under review. It's more concerning than I've ever been over the financial position of any council I've been involved in before.
Right, so.
Yeah, obviously we share those concerns. So just maybe remind members that Corporate Scrutiny is doing a task and finish group on the budget, and we've got our first meeting tomorrow, actually. So there is a lot of scrutiny going on around the budget separately outside this process. So just to give you that assurance.
Okay. Any further questions or issues? If not, then if we have to move on to any questions or comments on the annex on KCR 4. I mean, it's obviously a very comprehensive report, and there's much work, I guess, ongoing as well. So I think we're just happy to take it as read unless there's any issues. Councillor Merritt?
Yes, I was quite concerned when I read the annex on the KCR 4 and the analysis of the demographic effects. I'm not sure that the analysis here is entirely balanced. it clearly flags the issue that York's an attractive place and therefore we get a lot of migration in. What it doesn't cover is the impact of that inward migration in a restricted housing market and the consequence in terms of who it displaces. We know from the comparison of the 2021 census with the 2011 census that we actually drove a significant section of the existing population out during that period. With the exception of the student age group and over 55s, we lost about 8% of the population on average in the other age groups. And that surely is a particularly significant issue for us. One of the other issues with places with particularly high rents and housing expenses is an effect also on depressing the birth rate, which will have implications for schools, community facilities and other things, as will the loss of certain sections of the population. So I actually don't think the analysis that's behind this is actually adequate at the moment. I think it needs to be much more carefully looked at in terms of the implications, because some important things are missing from it at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm Sarah Story. I'm the Corporate Director for Adult Social Care and Integration, and I'm the Chief Officer nominated as the risk owner of this risk. So you're quite right, of course, and that's why, as we've identified in the paper, the intention to refresh the data that sits under this risk so that we can carry out a more up-to-date analysis of the impact of population changes as far as we can assess those. And clearly, obviously, it's considering the impact in terms of service delivery and demands to the council in terms of statutory responsibilities primarily. So I'm grateful to Peter Roderick, the Director of Public Health, and the team who are undertaking that refresh of the data at the moment. We probably wouldn't be bringing this risk back in detail for quite some time, but I'm very happy for us to share a paper with a written update on that when we've got that analysis together and we've made some or drawn some conclusions about that. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sure that would be helpful if that's possible. Any other issues, questions? No, I can't see any. So thank you for your time. Yeah, we look forward to that report in due course as well. Thank you. Move on then to item 6, which is Treasury Management Q1 report, which I think is Debbie.
Yep, so this is the Q1 report for 2025-26. This financial year outlines the activity during the first quarter of the year. As you will be aware, it's a statutory report required by the Prudential Code, and it was considered by Executive at their meeting yesterday. So you've got a brief covering report, and then you've got the Executive report as an annex, and then the annex to that Executive report. So it's here for your review, your scrutiny, your questions. It's the usual. It outlines a brief economic update, interest rate forecast. I think the main issue that we've discussed previously is we are keeping a close eye on our refinancing interest rate risk, just because we've been keeping that borrowing short term to see what interest rates do, and that means therefore we have a lot of debt maturing in a 12-month period, so we need to keep an eye on that, still within our approved maturity limits, so we're not concerned about it, but we are just keeping an eye on it. But we haven't undertaken any new borrowing during the first quarter of the year. The prudential indicators are included Annex 1, but again, we haven't really done anything in terms of new borrowing or new activity, and we're still within our prudential indicators, as you would expect at this time of year.
Okay, thank you. Any issues or questions? Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, well done. First of all, really proud of the report, and I understand the difficult circumstances in which the finance team are working. Obviously, we've got a number of economic events coming up, particularly with what's happened with bond yields today, but also the date of the budget being announced, I think 26th of November, and also we've had changes in the interest rates. I appreciate you've gone through sort of the economic environment up to a point, but just in result of the very recent events that we've had, I'm particularly thinking about bond yields, but also around the budget, whether there's any I suppose coming up to the risk factor as well, what kind of implication that might have when this report comes through again in a few months' time?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell really. What we'd like is our cost of borrowing to reduce, obviously, but that means we don't have a lot of money to invest, as you know, because we keep our cash low. So we'd really like interest rates to come down so that our cost of borrowing reduces, and we can then plot out and plan out our longer term borrowing to fill in those maturity gaps. So we've got a nice smooth line. But unfortunately, Treasury is more of an art than a science. And so we will have to just keep an eye. I don't expect there to be massive variation. We will be borrowing, as you know, part of our strategy is we were using cash balances to mitigate the need to borrow. We've exhausted those cash balances. So as you know, we are borrowing again, but we're only borrowing where we absolutely need to. And we're keeping a very close eye on cash flow so that we're not borrowing until we need to. Just because you don't want to pay more interest than you need to, and therefore, so if interest rates were to come down, that would be really positive, would allow us to lock in some longer term borrowing, which would give us that more certainty. And generally with the economy, as I'm sure you know, it's that uncertainty that just then creates that nervousness, if you like, in the market, doesn't it? And just means that things don't quite settle down. Hopefully, regardless of the outcome for this council on the fair funding review, we will at least have a 3-year settlement, and therefore that will create some certainty, albeit it might be a challenging position, but we will at least know what we're facing. Whereas, as you know, for certainly the last 4 or 5 years, I've been saying to you every year, this is the settlement, but next year it could be different. Well, we won't be in that position. We will know the challenge and we will be able to get on and deal with it. So certainly by the time we get a settlement at December, we should have a much clearer picture in terms of our treasury management activity.
Councillor Burton.
I just wanted to thank you personally for your diligence in all of this, because I know how hard you work, and I've been impressed by that in every meeting I've been to since I became a councillor. And I was pleased to see that, you know, total borrowing has gone down, and I know how carefully you're monitoring all these issues. I think you've just kind of answered one of the questions I was going to put was, do you see borrowing staying at that level, or do you think it could possibly go up?
Yeah, we will be borrowing more if in table 5 at paragraph 35 shows our underlying need to borrow, and you'll see that our total CFR, which is a capital financing requirement, is 570 million, and our borrowing at the moment is a lot less than that. Where are we? 331 million. So we've got a lot of headroom to go. We've got some chunks of borrowing, York Central being one, which will be, I think, this financial year. So we will definitely be borrowing more because our underlying need to borrow is significantly higher than our current level of borrowing, but that is budgeted for. That's not an area of concern. You'll recall that every year in the medium-term financial strategy, we include the cost of capital, and that is budgeted for as part of that, as part of the annual budget, that we are borrowing to invest in assets and infrastructure and all those different things.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rose.
Thank you very much again, as always, for the report and for the work done. I know people don't like it when I start a sentence with, there was a press article in the last week and I'd want you to comment on it, but there was a press article in the last week talking about council debt figures, and there was a hangover question as well from last A&G about the external debt number and the difference between that. Now, my reading of what was reported in the press and national figures is that national average for council debt went up by 6.7%, which is over double the inflation amount. York Council debt increased by just under 2%, which is actually below inflation for the last year. But I was being kind, the press article didn't necessarily hit all the right beats and ask all the right questions, but it'd be good to get a little bit of clarity on what that means, because we've got borrowing going down, but we've got debt increasing. But if it increases below inflation, is it actually increasing? Could you just shed some light, please?
Yeah, the article, I think, was part of a national piece of work on some data, wasn't it, around the government, the level of public sector borrowing, I think, as much as anything else. And then they brought that down into individual councils. But as you know, all councils are different, aren't they? So a lot of it's timing. So like I said, we've got York Central, 35 million borrowing coming up. I think this financial year, that's a significant chunk of borrowing for us. It's a relatively small council. For some other councils, that might just be every other Tuesday, you know, it's kind of, so they're very different. So it's very difficult to compare different councils, because what you need to look at is your underlying need to borrow. So they're the decisions that the council has made over the last however many years, that has committed the council to investment on the capital programme that will be funded from borrowing. The timing of that is what we do in Treasury management, because that's the bit where we work out the timing of it. But overall, we have an underlying need to borrow of 570 million. And ultimately, at some point, that's what our borrowing will be. It's just a timing matter. It is a concern if you are increasing borrowing to the point that the entirety of your revenue budget is servicing your debt. So that's why in our prudential indicators, we keep an eye on the proportion of our revenue budget that is spent servicing our debt, because that would then suggest that it's always about jam tomorrow and not about what's happening today. But of course, you've also got to consider that if you're investing in your assets and your infrastructure, it's not just today's taxpayers that benefit from that and therefore should be paying for that, but obviously future taxpayers as well. So it's that balance between borrowing for those things and then spreading that cost over a 25 year period, as opposed to, you know, so the asset would still be there and will still be providing a service to our residents and a benefit to our residents. So I think the national article, whilst interesting, couldn't get into the nuances of what different decisions are made by different councils that reflect the needs of their residents, and therefore you might have councils investing a lot in a certain amount of infrastructure because that's a need for them, and others not because they maybe did it 2 years ago, and therefore you're not really comparing like with like. So the key for us is, are we within our prudential indicators? Are we following our treasury management strategy? And are we making sure that we're not spending more than a reasonable proportion of our revenue budget on servicing our capital debt? Does that help?
Yes, it helps. And I guess it works both ways. We're less than a third of the national average. And there was, I think, one council increased by 50% in 1 year. But that's not necessarily good, because we still might be bad.
It's
because it
timing,
depends
isn't
on the
it?
circumstances.
Yeah, it depends on the circumstances. And you obviously can't compare the debt of York to the debt of, say, Birmingham, the largest local authority in Europe, to York. It's just not, you can't compare in that way. It's not appropriate, really.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, I read that article and tried to do some firefighting on it, because there were a lot of extremely uninformed comments about it. And one person said he would very happily come down and give you some advice if you needed it. And yeah, I thought it was very, 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 very kind of him, but he didn't understand at all the difference between revenue budget and capital budget. So I thought probably better not take him on. It's not about how much you borrow for capital programs, it's what you do with it. If you look at the councils that have got into desperate trouble, it's Thurrock, Spelthorne, Woking, who've invested in basically Ponzi schemes of property buying, and they've all gone bust and consequently lost a small fortune. Our capital borrowing is below average. It's very well managed. The budget, the actual interest payments are catered for. You take enormous time to make sure you borrow at the lowest possible rate, and you schedule your policies. I have no worries about the capital programme. It's focused towards development and ultimately bringing in further income. And that is what the capital programme is designed to do. The revenue budget is the different one, because of course that has to be balanced each year and you can't borrow. So consequently, that's the issue. The capital programme should not be a concern to anyone, in my view.
Okay. Any further issues? No. Thank you very much. Move on then to item 7, which is the constitution changes, which I guess is Bryn.
Thank you, Chair. So you'll see that there are two separate elements here. The first one is contract procedure rules. This is for members to note. It has been done under delegated powers because they are relating to changes in legislation. So that's something for members to note, and that will go on for council approval. Second, obviously, is the proposed changes to planning committee arrangements. We're joined by Becky Eads, and we're also joined by Councillor Pavlovic, who's the relevant executive member, who sits over that portfolio.
Yeah, do you want me to come forward?
Um,
I'm not sure an invitation is necessary, Chair, but
can do if you like. Yes. Okay, so shall we take the first, the contract procedure rules first? Just if there are any, I'm going straight to issues or questions, or is there anything you'd like to?
Really, this, if I may, this is effectively a fait accompli because Debbie has delegated authority to make the changes that have been made. So the constitution requires that they are reported up to council for council's subsequent approval, but they're not here for members to start tinkering, shall we say.
Okay. Any issues, questions on the contract rules, Councillor Rose?
Yeah, I guess it's just a note from me on the notes. We're here to note it because it is a change to reflect that the national changes and how we undertake procurement, etc. And so from that perspective, this is all perfectly fine. But we've also noted at this committee previously concerns around, for example, the Salvation Army contract we mentioned earlier, libraries contract, station frontage, project contract, and other issues that we may at some point decide are constitutional issues we might want to fix. And those ones I assume would have to come through this and then go to full council because they're not just made to adapt to a national situation. So just wanted to get that clarified because we may, after the next report comes back, have something in that space to look at.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fisher?
Thank you, Chair. It's just a clarification on page 141, paragraph 18.6.1. Is that another way of saying penalty clauses? So it says include provision for payment of liquidated and ascertained damage by a supplier for delay or breach of contract where appropriate. Is that another way of saying penalty clauses on contracts? Because in my experience, having dealt with a couple of fairly major contracts previously, penalty clauses really focus the mind of the actual supplier of that contract to actually deliver on time and on budget.
Yeah, it's about those guaranteed and liquidated damages and what what you include as an assurance, and it's just that is a I don't think that bit's changed actually, but that's just the chief officer's responsibility, taking advice from procurement and legal as to what to include. Sometimes they're appropriate. Obviously, sometimes if terms are too onerous, you don't get any tenders. So it's working with the market and seeing what we need to protect us, but also what's acceptable to the market to make sure you get some competitive bids.
Okay, thank you. I think we all seem relatively happy with those. I'm assuming that's not in response to the contract rules. Okay, if we can move on then to the planning committee changes, and yeah, thank you and welcome to Becky and Councillor Pavlovich.
If I can just briefly say, so members will see in the covering report the changes that are proposed. I presume from that report that all members are clear what is being asked of them and what changes are proposed. So you can see abolition of Committee B, renaming of Committee A, amending of the scheme of delegation to make the provisions that are listed there, with all other applications being delegated, public participation in accordance with the arrangements that are set out at page 165. So I presume that members are clear that that's what's being presented to them.
Okay.
So with that, I'll hand over to Becky.
I'm going to say I don't really have a lot to add to that. I think it's more of the context of why this was drawn in, which is why Councillor Pavlovich is sat next to me. I was tasked with looking at how we would speed up the decision making as part of the planning process and to ensure that the decisions were robust and that we were providing good customer service in terms of our timeliness. We've looked at a number of things in terms of doing that, the first of which was the planning protocol and the one opportunity process. That's already been implemented, is working really well. The second part of that was to look at the planning committee changes, which are now in front of you. So it's all part of a wider piece of work, but that's the background as to why we are looking at doing what we're doing. I think I've just really to hear questions, if you answer any questions, if you've got them.
Okay, thank you. I guess we could start with specific questions to Becky and Councillor Pavlovich, and we'll save the soapboxes for a little later. Go on, Councillor Whitcroft.
Yes, I mean, we obviously had a lot of comments and questions from members of the public at the beginning. I think one of the things that would be quite useful for context for the discussion on this is what is the current level of delegated decisions by officers as opposed to members. Comments were made about members needing to run all this process. The reality is we only deal with a very small proportion of planning decisions already. And also there are minimum figures that the government sets and how we compare with other authorities.
So we are looking at, these are the figures for the year ending March 2025. We were at percentage of delegated decisions to officers was 96%, which is round about the national average. In terms of the number of applications that we've had across both committees over the last 12 months, we've had 54 applications go to planning committee. Of those 54, only 4 of them have been overturned for officer decisions. The 4 that were overturned, you've already heard about 2. They were for where the recommendation was for refusal and members decide to approve. The other 2 were where officers was recommending approval and the decision was refused. One of these has already been allowed by the planning inspectorate. So there's that to consider in part of the information that you've got. In terms of, so I've done some work in terms of the last, as I said, 54 applications went to committee last year. 19 of these applications were call-ins and 3 of the call-ins were overturned. So it's a really small proportion of the decisions that have been made that are actually being, it's 7% of all the decisions that are coming to committee are overturns. 22 applications all went with the officer recommendations, would through the proposals no longer need to be considered by committee. And then the remaining 13 applications would still need to be to be considered by committee, and they were on major residential cases. And again, they all went with the recommendation. So there is some work being done there in terms of how many we consider in the percentage of overturns, and the majority do go with the officer recommendation, and where they don't, we do tend to get appeals allowed. So that's it by way of explanation of what we've had in the last 12 months. If that helps.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Whitcroft?
I'm very sorry. It's going to be asking sort of around the same thing. There are a lot of figures there. I just wanted to be absolutely sure there. So 54 applications have come to planning committee over the past 12 months. 19 of those were call-ins and only 3 of those overturned the officer decision. Is that correct? And how many of those have been overturned? And sorry, what were the appeal statistics again, please?
There was one that the officer recommended for approval, which was refused by members, and the appeal was allowed. So there's been one that's happened. So that was a committee B item. The other item was refused, but we haven't had an appeal yet, but they are still within the time frame to appeal if they wanted to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fisher?
Thank you. How many of those applications have conditions added or amended as a result of member involvement?
But they still went with the recommendation. They were just varied on the original back. So they either added a condition or changed something, or it didn't change the principle of what the officer recommendation was.
No, but it actually showed member involvement can sometimes lead to a better outcome. Or a different
That's your
outcome.
opinion.
Different outcome. Right.
Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. Can you tell me what consultation has there been in respect of these proposed changes?
Could bring at this point, but I don't think constitution changes require
No,
further down.
this is an internal process only for the council. So this is the council's decision-making process. It doesn't require external consultation. So what happens is proposals are prepared and they are submitted to the groups. The groups consider them through Constitution Working Group at the moment, then they come here, then they go to council.
Has it gone off? Thanks. One thing is requirement, and the other thing is good practice. Bearing in mind the level of very erudite and strong opposition which has been amply expressed tonight, and we have all seen in our quote postbags quote, wouldn't it have been wise to have had something of a wide consultation?
I don't necessarily think so, because ultimately it is the council's decision as to how it deals with these administrative applications. And I think we need to be clear, these are admin applications, not quasi-judicial. There's clear House of Lords decision on that. So this is about the council's operating procedure.
But the decision whether or not to grant planning consent is not an administrative process.
Yes, it is. It is absolutely an administrative process.
Well, we'll have to have a jurisprudential argument outside of this debate, I think. But
I would refer you to
I would certainly come to the conclusion.
Decision from the House of Lords.
It is. Okay, the House of we'll park that one for the moment. But we'll have the debate later. We have a parish charter, don't we?
We do, yes.
On which we pledge we will consult with our parishes over significant aspects.
Yes.
Are you saying this is not an aspect to consult with parishes, or are you saying
there's no requirement to do so? Parish councils are a consultee on planning applications, like many other statutory consultees.
Indeed, yes.
But that doesn't change the fact that we do not need to consult in relation to changes to the Constitution.
There's a lot of need I'm hearing.
Well, just a point of information, if I may briefly, there are members here who don't have parish councils.
Yeah,
so some of us, if we don't have the ability to input on there, asking parish councils for specific feedback.
Through you, Chair, there are planning
Keep conversation through the chair. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. I would point out that some of those parish councils have gone through considerable amounts of sweat and blood to produce neighbourhood plans to influence planning in their areas. They have invested a huge sum of money in that. These decisions that we have before us today, these proposals, will limit the possibility of parish councils having the right to actually speak at public meetings, because the public meetings won't happen. And I have consulted three of my parish councils, which are in my ward. None of them in any way support these changes. They're absolutely opposed to them. The town council that I sit on discussed this matter at the meeting on Monday night and also strongly oppose these changes. You're going to face a rebellion, I'm afraid, on this from the parishes. And, you know, if you want to take the parishes on, fine. You have the power to implement these, but you will lose. The parish charter is absolutely clear. It says we will aim to give local councillors the opportunity to comment before making a decision which affects the local community. In furtherance to this, the City of York Council will send the agendas of its executive meetings, to local council clerks at the same time as sent to members of the council. Now, this does affect the ability of parish councils to be involved in planning, and it should, in my view, have been consulted on.
Chair, you've got Councillor Pavlovic.
No, it doesn't. Parish councils, planning panels, local ward councillors still have the same opportunity to object to an application when it comes in, when it's advertised, which they all are, and for that to be taken into account. And I'd just go back to point out that certainly there are two members, if not more, that this council used to have 3 planning committees, and four planning committees, and it went down to 2. It was a decision that was made by council, and now people are saying, oh, well, it wasn't, it was democratic then, it's not democratic now. Didn't go through to consultation, didn't go through to wider consultation. It was a decision that was made by council. So, you know, there is precedent for making these decisions. And you've already heard from the monitoring officer that the process that needed to be followed has been followed. All groups have been consulted with. And I know that Becky has spoken to them all. I've also spoken to you, Chair. You've made some suggestions which I'm happy to consider around members' input. So, you know, it has gone through the internal process that it needed to go through. Parish councils can still speak at issues that go to committee, and you've already heard that the majority of applications that need to go to committee will go to committee. 96% of them don't go to committee anyway.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the question's been asked, should it have, you know, should parishes have been consulted or the wider public? In the view of the council, they don't need to be. Whether or not that's agreed with, I think we'll probably just need to park that for now. But Councillor Rose?
Thank you. It was just to say that the part that the parish councils play in the planning process won't change as part of these constitutional changes. We will still consult them. They can still send their representations in. It will not change how they are involved in that process. That's not what these proposals are. That is a different aspect. If we were going to change how we consult people or anything else, absolutely, but this won't change as part of this process.
Okay. So Rose?
Yeah, I've got a few questions based on public participation, but I didn't want, you know, this isn't the debate bit, but just to come back on that, and not to draw party lines early. I know that was one of the comments made in public participation, but we only have one councillor in the Labour Party who has a parish council, and they're the only parish council who came tonight. So with all due respect to all but 4 of the Lib Dems, who all have parish councils and who apparently mumble it to a councillor they know and hope it bubbles through, I'm very happy to go to any parish council and train them in how to engage with the democratic process, because none of them have come and commented tonight or emailed us in advance or said anything about this directly. So I don't want it to be a war waged between council and parish council, of course not, but I'm slightly concerned that the fixation on that specific thing instead of how to engage with planning in general is pointing down the wrong avenue. But I do think that Karen made a perfectly valid point around, or at least that I don't fully understand, around the right for parish councils to speak and the max number of people who can speak, and whether you can be timed out by being the last to apply as a parish council, and the right to speak there if you have raised an objection. I just wanted to get your take on what exactly is the new rule and whether that changes at all, if that's okay.
Sorry, whilst Becky's looking it up, that's not changed one iota. That already exists. Public participation does not have a veto or a dispensation for parish councils above ward councillors. Ward councillors, when they're making representations on behalf of their constituents, are incorporated and separate to the public participation. Parish councils have never been given a special dispensation. Certainly not in the time that I've been a councillor, and you know, I may be corrected by those that have got much longer whether parish councils did have a veto. But, you know, I stand to be corrected, but they don't have that power now.
That's Fisher.
Thank you. Parish councils never had an automatic right to speak at committee, but they have spoken on many, many occasions. I've spoken, John Chapman, my former chair of planning, spoke numerous times. The point is you can't speak at a meeting which doesn't take place because that application doesn't go to committee. That's where the problem is. The parish councillors are deprived of their right to put the comments directly and their explanations. They can still provide written comments, but they can't come to a committee and explain the point in person because the applications, many applications won't come to committee.
With all due respect, that wasn't my question. My question was what the public
Sorry,
participant.
can we keep it through the chair instead of
I'm
having
just
debate
clarifying
table?
that the question I asked
You'll get a chance to
was what public
clarify.
participation asked,
Okay.
which is about the 3-person limit number of speakers and whether that impacts parish councils. That was
Okay.
specifically what they raised as a concern.
What we're doing at the moment is asking questions for clarification. Don't want debate across the table. Councillor Merritt.
I'd just note before I make my main question that parish councils can't speak on 96% of the applications now. The difference will be between 96 and 97.5 or whatever. I was actually that was the question I was coming to. Sorry, but
Sorry, I
yeah.
just wanted to clarify where we were in terms of the speakers because they don't form part of the constitutional change. Bryn, stop me if I'm wrong at this point. I don't think they do. So we were looking at, it's the chair's discretion for the number of speakers, and that would be intended to continue. What we were looking at was a maximum to try and regulate the points that were raised. So what we did, so as part of the process that we were looking at, and I'll talk you through them. There was one in support, one in objection, and a ward member based on a first come, first served basis. But then we also looked at one in support, one in objection, and a ward member. Speakers are then selected by the chair based on the points raised. And then a maximum of 3 in support, 3 in objection, and ward members on a first come, first served basis, or chair's discretion for the number of speakers based on the application, but limited to a maximum of 10 speakers in total. That was to basically, the limiting to 10 was to stop the amount of time that potentially that the committees run over. So that was still at a point of debate, but there were what we were looking at in terms of speaker changes. That isn't intended to change as part of the constitution, that's part of other remit.
Councillor Watson.
Thank you. Yeah, to complete the point Councillor Fisher has made, the point is once you've got a speaker into the chamber, you can have a dialogue between the speaker and members, and many times that reveals a new dimension which is taken into account in the decision-making process. And I hear everything Councillor Merritt has said about non-changes, but the point is these proposals seek to restrict those matters which can be called in, and therefore there is going to be more and more non-dialogue because there will not be speakers capable of speaking to a meeting.
Chair, are we in debate mode or in question mode? Because that wasn't a question. And when this side of the table have engaged, you've reprimanded us. And when that side of the table made points about without questions, you've not reprimanded them. So I'd just like to understand, are we in debate mode or are we in question mode?
Give me a chance. The question's being asked around the relationship of the parish councils and consultation. The answer's been given that the council doesn't believe that any consultation is required. The wiseness of that is an open question, but we've clearly reached an impasse. So can we move on now, I think, on Councillor Rose?
Yeah, I've still got a bit of that question and then all my other questions, but the bit of that is page 165, the annex. That big paragraph in the call and request bit specifies there will be a maximum of 3 speakers in favour, 3 speakers against, together with ward members, and that's what the public participant was referencing. You've said a maximum of 10 in total, but that isn't what I'm reading there. Is this supposed to be a description of what is already in place? Thank you, sorry.
I should know better. That's what we're looking at. That's the process that we went through, that we were looking at those options.
Okay.
That were then, I was trying to explain what we'd got, how we'd got to where we'd got to.
Understood. So we're looking at potentially having 10 in total at chair's discretion, or only having one of each, or what the balance was, and this was the balance that was felt most appropriate from planning officer's perspective.
That's where we'd got to through discussions at this, that was the most reasonable option.
Fab, thank you. In terms of the other public participants and some questions off the back of them, Christian was talking about section 106 risk. Personally, my memory of what I've experienced is that we haven't actually varied what the officer recommends in section 106 amounts, for example, how much they say schools should get, because that's all algorithm driven. And most of the question in terms of concern around 106 is how much has been spent out of those massive pots that come from these massive planning applications that come through anyway. But I just want to get your take on whether you feel this increases the risk around section 106 not being allocated properly or spent properly.
No, is my answer to that. I don't think it will, because we still have the same procedures and processes and policies that govern how we make that ask. I say this all the time at planning committee, they're an evidence-based ask. That to mitigate the development, they've got to, all the legal requirements they've got, they will be the same. They won't change through the planning committee process. That won't change.
Thank you.
Through these changes.
If I can ask another few or three. I know that you went through this at the last committee, and I don't know if everybody who participated in public or who will be watching this is aware this already came for discussion to this committee, and you answered a bunch of questions then. But Kevin made the point around the level of detail in the paper and the 10 to 50 mid-tier of 3 tiers split, and the fact that we've got 40 on here as our threshold. And then Johnny talked about the call-in details and you know, some of the specifics around what things are excluded from being called in. And I just wondered if you could talk around the rationale for how did we reach this level in terms of it being the right level, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. Well, obviously we went through all the figures over the last few years of what had been to planning committee, what had not been to planning committee. Where we started at was potentially the ones that have no reason to come to planning committee because they're triggered either by the size, they're not even a call-in, they are just, so I'm going to have to give you a specific, so say for example, the designer outlet in the car park, that was a officer recommendation for refusal, members refused it, debated it. There was no call-in, there was no reason for that to come to committee apart from the size of it. So that is something that we knocked those off the list. So the ones that were the ones that don't come to committee for any reason other than its size, we decided that residential development is the one that is obviously the most contentious. Clearly, it's the one where we get the representations. 40 is already the trigger for committee A, hence why we kept that trigger. We didn't want to change that. In terms of the other changes, we looked at, basically we went through previous statistics, we looked at what didn't come, and the majority of cases that come are either call-ins on house extensions or HMOs or things like that. And can I be clear that this won't necessarily stop that. They will still come because it will be a decision that we make based on the call-in, the planning reasons in that call-in, because they will require planning reasons, which it does now, but we're going to give a specific pro forma to members to fill out to make sure that they put the planning reasons in there that we can then consider. We'll then have a meeting with the chair and vice chair and walk through it with either myself or one of the other senior officers that will give advice around whether or not we consider that this will go to committee. As part of that, there are sometimes applications that we as officers, well, I as an officer decide that need to come to committee. That will remain. So an example of that is, if you will recall, the portico at the front of the station, that wasn't called in. There was no reason for it to come, but I decided as officers that was of significance, that it needed to be considered by members. That will remain. So there is still that oversight there. It's not a blanket. If you call it in, it's not going to come to committee. It may still come to committee if we think that there is a valid planning reason that needs a debate. It will still come. It is not to stop the democratic process. It's to allow us to make speedier decisions on ones that don't necessarily need to be considered by members. That's the whole reason behind it, is to, if you've got a planning application, a householder application that gets called into committee, you're looking at adding another 6 to 8 weeks to your decision if it's going to planning committee, because of the timescales involved, the officer time, everything. It slows down the whole process for this. Slows it down for the bigger ones, but they tend to slow themselves down just due to the amendments and everything else that happens with them. But the smaller ones, where we want to get people building, we want people to be able to have extensions, we will speed up that process for decisions by allowing this to happen, and that's part of the rationale as well.
Just to follow up on that, if that's okay. I fully appreciate that answer, thank you. And it's obviously very clear in here that, for example, senior planning officers can bring things to committee even outside of the specified examples. And there's loads of scenarios where councillors can call things in and it's not impacted at all. I think the specific thing that was raised by the member of the public was, it says the following items will not be considered for determination even if a call-in is submitted, and it includes, for example, they mentioned relevant demolition in a conservation area. And so it sounds like, slightly contrary to what you just said, or my understanding of it, there are situations where even if someone raises a call-in and officers agree, it will not be considered for determination. I just wonder if that's a misunderstanding of what the words are saying, or...
They mostly don't come now anyway. It's just written down because if they're time bound. So say, for example, like telecom notifications or demolition notifications, we have to make a decision within, I might get this wrong because I'm not, I might think it's 28 days maybe for a demolition in a conservation area. That can't get to committee by anybody's means. So it doesn't come now. It's just that it's written down in the process.
So are all of these bullet points scenarios like that?
Not all of them, no. But again, we reviewed what had come to planning committee. There's been a few listed buildings that are linked to full permissions or have just been called in generally. There's nothing to say that still won't be the case. The other ones don't tend to come to planning committee because they're time bound and we don't get that. We've just reviewed what has been so far and basically put it in writing.
Thanks.
It's not really changing what's happening, it's just putting it in writing.
Okay, just on that, so obviously the government consultation, so that it talks about sort of special control applications like tree applications and things like that, and that itself recognises that they can in some cases be, go to committee and shouldn't necessarily all be delegated. And I guess this gets to a bit of the issue overall about why we're doing this now rather than waiting for the outcome of the government's consultation. So I guess, why aren't we taking that sort of thing into account where the government itself is saying these things should not necessarily be all delegated, and yet we are?
We haven't taken any tree applications to committee in the last year. I can't think of any that we have taken in. I mean, they are literally a handful in the whole of the time I've been here. So we've looked at everything that's been before and made that decision on that basis. In terms of the changes that are coming through government, we don't know if and when, and these changes will make a difference in terms of our customer service because we'll be able to determine planning applications quicker. It will make a difference in terms of giving officers capacity, not just planning officers, you've got your legal officers, you've got your democratic officers, everybody that forms part of this process, you are giving capacity for us to then be able to deal with applications quicker, as well as obviously, and this isn't but the cost savings that come with all of that. The 2 committees a month, so you're taking, on average, it takes senior officers a week out of every month to deal with the planning committee. You're giving a senior officer within the council a whole week back to be able to do work that isn't planning committee. That is a huge difference in the terms of capacity you're going to give your planning department.
Yeah, obviously there's other ways of doing that as well. So just to go back just to the list of issues, I think it was mentioned earlier that applications to vary or remove conditions in section 73, and there's a bit of a contradiction between those two. So applications to vary or remove conditions unless permission was originally granted by the planning committee, and applications made on section 73 of the Town and Country Planning Act. Now, I thought section 73 applications, where applications do vary or remove conditions. So there looks to be a discrepancy or a contradiction there.
Not necessarily, because non-material changes can vary, they don't necessarily change conditions, but there is, oh, this is drawing on my technical knowledge, but there's non-material change as well as section 73s, and that's why that's in there. Non-material changes don't come to planning committee now.
But they're also listed separately.
Because they're not, say again, sorry?
They're also listed separately.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't know, I'll have to look that one up, 2 seconds. I think that was to cover variation of conditions of major applications that are being considered by planning committee. So say, for example, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of one that we brought that was a variation of condition for a major. I don't think that we have. I don't know the answer to that one. There's no point me saying I do, because I don't. I'll have to relook at it.
Okay. Councillor Fisher.
A question. The moment limit for bringing them to committee is 40. What is to stop a developer who has a field that wants to put 60 houses on coming forward with 30, an application for 30, and then a second application for 30 to complete circumvent plan?
We would have to look at that, how it was considered as a whole. You were at the committee where we took the ST application that only put half of the site in, and we didn't have sufficient information to consider both halves. We'd have to consider that. If they were doing that, then we, as officers, potentially would go, well, okay, that's 60 altogether, it needs considering by members. That is, it's not meant to circumnavigate, and officers aren't daft. We're not going to go, oh, it's only 30 and 30, so it's not, that's not how it's in. We are not intending for it to be the system that is played, because there are very clearly still triggers in there that will bring applications to committee. And I would question, if somebody's putting in 30 and 30 on the same site, how do they link? And potentially, would we even be recommended approval? I don't. Do you see what I mean? It's not necessarily. I see what you're saying. Somebody will try and play the system. But if somebody was to put, if there was a site that was big enough to accommodate 60 but only put 30 in, that wouldn't necessarily be acceptable, because again, we would go down the lines of, well, you're not achieving the right density. So I don't want developers to, it's not for developers to circumnavigate the system. It's to allow us to make speedier decisions on the other applications that aren't going to committee.
Councillor.
Sorry. Yes, Becky's partly answered the question. It was about the workload and the savings and the efficiency. I think it's been substantially picked up. I'll save my other comments for the debate.
Councillor Rose.
Yeah, my final question for public participation was, I think Andy raised the point around public perception, and I think that's a valid challenge around this. You know, there is a perception sometimes decisions are made behind closed doors, and this can exacerbate that. I don't think that's a reason to make a decision. We just have to manage public perception. But I also wanted to call up the opposite of that, which is there is public perception from experts and from those who've gone through this process that it is a slow process, that councillors are too involved, particularly compared to lots of other councils. Where my understanding is this list is much more similar to the kind of norm in councils, and we've been a bit heavy-handed in the past. But also the application slip, I know the RSPCA have been particularly peeved by the timing of when meetings are and stuff. And I just wondered if you could kind of give a head knowledge guess from your experience of roughly how many applications a year either miss the next meeting because it's the wrong type of meeting, or the meeting gets cancelled because it doesn't, the officers can't be there, or councillors can't be there, or there's some sort of glitch that means that people end up waiting 8 weeks instead of 2 weeks. And I think that I don't know if that's 1 a year or if that's 30 a year. So
no, that does happen. I wouldn't necessarily say it happens if a case officer isn't there, because one of us will tend to pick it up. But it does happen. Either it just misses the deadline because of when the information was submitted, because I know that one, we've been working on that one for a really long time. But then when the information is submitted, you then miss the next deadline day. To So yeah, it does happen in terms of timing and how many we think we can consider. Yeah, it can be quite slow, but as I said, from what I'd looked at previously, if you've got a householder application, you're adding at least 6 to 8 weeks on your determination, because you've got 8 weeks to determine a householder application. You're looking at double that if it's going to planning committee. In terms of customer service, that's a really long time.
Okay, that's Pavlovich.
Couple of points, I think. One, to take Councillor Rose's last question, relating to timescales of bringing issues to committee. And Becky's talked already about applications that come through that you would have thought, well, they're going through on the nod, that take hours and then go through on the nod, essentially. But for all of those with the officer recommendation of approval, you've got the public parties, you've got the more often than not just a developer, an applicant coming in, talking at length, and then it gets approved. And you know, and I watch most of the planning committees online, and you know, the number of times I've heard committee members saying, we've just spent 45 minutes or an hour and 45 minutes on debating something that we knew that we were going to approve. Every time you do that, there's another application that's now been held off, that's ready to roll, that could have come to committee, that hasn't. And so you keep pushing cases that are ready for decision further and further and further back. And that's one of the problems that we get. And that's one of the reasons why when we meet with both developers, but also the public, are saying, why aren't we building more houses? Well, we could be building a lot more houses, but we can't get the application processed. So that's one issue. And the second one that I would just like to, I'd just like to challenge the assertion that that was made by Councillor Fisher, that developers will game the system. Planners, and there are some planners here, are professionals. They've worked and they've developed skills and they've got qualifications and they've been through this process. You seem to be treating them as though, unless there's a councillor to hold their hand, they're going to get walked all over. And I think that's a massive, massive disrespect for the skill set of our senior planners that are working not just in York but around the country. If somebody brings a scheme of 30 when the density clearly indicates there's going to be 60, you think a planner's not going to identify that. It's just patronising.
I don't think anybody's saying that, but that argument just leads to every decision being made by an officer. The whole point of having a council is to bring in a democratic aspect to the decisions.
Sorry, Councillor
Councillor Fisher.
Totally misunderstood what I was saying. I was not criticising in any way the planning officers. I have great respect for them. I've worked with them closely in the past as chair of planning. I have huge respect for our planning officers. What I'm saying is that if you have a site that can potentially take 60, the developer will put an initial application for half the site for 30. That will not have to go to the planning committee. Then further, they will bring the second half site. You often see this situation where people put planning applications through in phases anyway. The second point I'd bring up, but ask you, can you tell me how many sites in York have been land banked for many, 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 many years? If it's such a problem, which have planning permission, but have not proceeded. I'll give you a few if you like. Monk's Cross, the land there, We know that this application north of Haxby is not likely to come forward for reserve matters for some year, at least 2 years, according to our latest information. The site by the bar, can you give me some others?
Briefly, I mean, these, we know what the answers to these are.
Land banking is an issue that, yes, all governments need to address, and that's a national legislative thing. I'm talking about applications that are in, that have been submitted, that have been considered by officers. There's a massive difference between a land bank where nothing's coming forward for years and an application that's already in.
Can we get back to questions? Councillor
Chair. Councillor, you made the observation a few moments ago that lengthy debates are delaying decision makings in respect of other applications. Because the committee takes so long to discuss a particular application, it is not capable of dealing with a further application, and that is put back.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. There's a limit to how many applications can come to any one committee. Always has been, always will be. Well, so if at the moment, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Becky, Planning Committee A will only consider 2 applications at a time. 3. We've got 3 coming up.
That was because of the,
yeah.
Sorry. We've got 3 coming up, but we had an August break.
Yes.
So we needed.
So that's why, but normally
it's 2.
The Planning Committee will only consider. Sorry. We've got 3 this month because we missed August, and we had to try to clear the backlog. But normally Planning Committee A will consider 2. Now, that's the point I'm trying to make. I don't care how long each committee lasts. If it lasts 8 hours, it lasts 8 hours. But the point is that only 2 applications are going to be considered at that planning committee.
Well, I'm aghast by that as an answer. And certainly I'm going to. And certainly it's been my experience in the last 6 months. If I wind the clock back some years, main planning, as then it was called, would frequently take 6 or more applications. And I'm just wondering, therefore, why that what I would consider an artificial barrier is being put on.
Because of the length of the time the applications are taking to be considered. 5 hours for the one that we talked about, the outline application. That's a really long time for a consideration, and I get that it needed a level of scrutiny, but as if we're trying to build houses, 5 hours worth of planning committee. I'm not trying to build. If we're trying to, it was recommended for approval, and it took 5 hours as debate. You can't put another application on, as well as that one, knowing that it's going to take 5 hours, because that's not fair on officers. It's not fair on members. It's not fair on the member of the public that sat waiting 5 hours to then have theirs considered afterwards. There's a reason why we only put that money on. It's because of the amount of time planning committees are taking.
Okay. So as a supplementary, is it a situation planning councillors need better training?
Members had training directly before that 5 hour meeting on planning committees, and how we had a whole day's worth of training that involved officers and members, and it still took 5 hours.
My own observations are, and I don't know whether Councillor Merritt would agree, because he naturally is a long-serving planning councillor, is that the mode of debate today is a very different mode to how it was in the past, and verbosity is the word which comes to my mind.
So, I mean, that has led to a particular decision, but it didn't need to lead to that decision, sort of what alternatives were considered. We could, for example, have cut the number of councillors on planning and had more planning committees, or had a planning committee which met more frequently. You know, like licensing has a licensing committee, and then it has hearings every week and all over the place with 3 people.
But I've just explained to you how much officer time it takes to do a planning committee. If you're going to start increasing planning committees, you're going to stagnate the system in the background, because you're in a constant committee cycle at the moment where you've got a committee every 2 weeks. That's taking, as I say, you've got legal officers, you've got democratic officers, but as planning officers, the amount of time that it takes, you will grind us to a halt if you put more committees in rather than less. You won't get timely decisions. We'll then have to pay fees back because we won't be making timely decisions. The knock-on and ramifications of that is huge, because we don't have capacity to add more planning committees in.
Well, that depends on the resource, doesn't it? Councillor Merritt?
Yes, I just wanted to make the point on gaming the system. I mean, that has always been a problem, but correct me if I'm wrong, the new local plan specifically addresses the issue of applicants gaming the system in terms of splitting up sites and so on. And I think it pretty explicitly says that the site will be considered as a whole, to rule out that type of gaming. Now, you can't stop it entirely. I mean, we always had it with the 15, the previous 15 limit for small developments, and a large proportion of applications coming in at 14 and things like that. There's a limit to what you can do, but we do absolutely rely on officers to spot when it's a piece of gaming and expose it and stamp on it. That will always be the case, and I don't think that requires members to be involved when we've now got a local plan in place that's quite specifically addresses it.
And that's not to say that it won't still continue to happen, but I would imagine on the larger sites they'll be triggered because they'll be over 40 anyway.
Councillor Whitcroft?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, changing the subject slightly, but just related to the national legislation we've heard that's going through Parliament now. There will definitely be changes to the planning arrangements, amendments, and what have you. To what extent has that influenced this sort of decision? I think there's a fine line between preemptive and actually prepared, and I think this shows a great deal of preparedness that we're willing to change our planning system in knowledge of what's going forward. Is there anything specifically about the government's decision and framework that has influenced or added impetus to these changes that we've got?
We've clearly looked at them in terms of the timescales and everything else. We did try to dovetail it as much as we possibly could, but there is potentially a step. We have gone a step further in terms of what we've looked at, but we've taken our individual circumstances as part of that process. Obviously, that's a nationwide. You can't, as we were talking about earlier, you can't use Birmingham and then, I don't know, say the Yorkshire Dales National Park. You can't possibly consider them in the same respect in terms of how and that's part of the issues that obviously the government's working through at the minute in terms of how that works because of the disparities in there. So we've taken into account what the government said, but we've also looked at our local issues and how we think this best works for us. So we've done both. Under the councils, yeah, we did a review of other councils and how they worked and what they did, and that also informed how we worked.
Okay. So the government has specifically said that we shouldn't be changing our scheme of delegation whilst that consultation's going on. So has that featured?
They've said that we can't change our scheme of delegation.
And said that we shouldn't.
Well, they haven't said we can't.
Yeah, but if the emphasis is to do what the government, to get ahead of the government, but the government's saying, don't do this.
I have to say, I'm not aware of any edict from the government saying we can't or shouldn't change, but ultimately the council's constitution is a matter for the council.
The Planning Advisory Service, which is a government body, the government is currently considering whether there should be a national scheme of delegation that applies to all councils in England. We suggest you do not carry out any reviews of your scheme of delegation until the mandatory requirements for the scheme of delegation are clarified by the government. So, I mean, that's just saying what is obvious, really, which is making significant changes at this point when obviously we're just going to have to make a load of changes in a few months' time, potentially.
What was that quote, sorry? Suggested you not.
Sorry?
What was the quote?
Want me to read it out
Yeah,
again?
that's okay.
The government is currently considering whether there should be a national scheme of delegation that applies to all councils in England. We suggest that you do not carry out any reviews of your scheme of delegation until the mandatory requirements for the scheme of delegation are clarified by the government.
So just for clarity, Chair, that is not a government body, it's part of a local government association. So it's not actually an edict from government.
But they produce the advice in consultation with the government. So they're not going to produce anything that it's an obvious thing that we shouldn't be doing, but.
Well, it may be obvious to you, Chair. It's not obvious to me because we know we have problems with processing applications in this authority because of all the issues that Becky Eads has highlighted to the committee. As an authority, we have a responsibility to ensure that we are operating the authority efficiently and effectively. Simply delaying tackling an issue that we know needs to be tackled because of the government's consultation. I think it's an argument and it's a legitimate debate, but I think there's a clear case for sorting this out. It also comes back to the point that was made by a person in the gallery that we should only change our delegation scheme when the government's changing the basic rules. No, we have a responsibility as an authority to operate this council efficiently and effectively. And when we recognise there's issues to be addressed, we should get on and do it. Clearly, we've in doing so, officers have taken account of what's emerging from the government and to a degree reflected that. But the main motivation comes in terms of sorting our existing problems.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for those comments, which I absolutely agree with. And there is a significant change in York that are York's, if you like, local circumstances, and that is we've just approved a local plan. The first local plan since 1957, correct me if I'm wrong on that, Councillor Fisher. I think you were involved in the planning process. And what we're seeing, and the whole intention of having the local plan, which was agreed across council, was that it would signify that York is going to start building. Whether you agreed with the numbers or whether you didn't agree with the numbers, we approved it. We've approved 13,000 homes over the next 15, 18 years. Those applications are coming through. The amount of time, and I sit with Becky and with other officers around the pre-app process of these major sites that are coming through. They are taking up so much of our time, and rightly so, because these are major applications that. You mentioned resources. Well, yeah, we could triple the size of the planning committee. We could make it the same size as social care, but we can't because we can't afford to do that. There's a finite number of staff that authority that any LPA or any local authority can justify. So how do we streamline the process? How do we recognise which is what I asked Becky in 2023, knowing that we were going to have a local plan. I did think it might have been a year earlier than it was, but I was expecting the imminent approval of that. And how are we going to get ourselves ready? And she's come back with a series of proposals, which I think are going to be, as Councillor Merritt has just said, our way of being able to address local circumstances with a duly adopted local development plan for the city.
Councillor Rose and Councillor Fishing.
Thanks. I just wanted to give context for the quote that you gave. There was only one match on the internet, thankfully, which saved me having to dig around for where it came from originally. It's from the Planning Advisory Service, how to use the Planning Committee self-assessment tool, advice on completing part 2 of the toolkit. So it is very specific in context, and the word after the quote that you gave is however, and then it goes on for some specifics that are exceptions for when you should and shouldn't carry out reviews. So it's basically saying, don't carry out a review because there's a national scheme of delegation going on. Don't preempt the results of that, but it doesn't stop you from making reviews if there are other reasons to do so. Which I guess is what's been brought to us. But I guess to ask that as a question, is there any part of this that you've, from what you've seen so far of that national change, looks like it might be at odds with it? Is there anything where we're not moving in the right direction, but we might be moving away from it, which was kind of implied earlier by somebody?
I think we have, as I said before, we've taken it into account in terms of what they are proposing. But I think the key thing for me is it's still got a lot more process to go through in terms of that before it even gets anywhere near being implemented on the ground. So there's still considerable changes that could happen. So it's really difficult for me to say. At the moment, we think it mostly dovetails, but yes, we will acknowledge that there are slight differences. But we don't know what it's going to look like by the time it's been all through the processes that it's got to go through in government. It could look completely different by the end.
But we do know the consultation finished over a month ago, and so we're due the government's response to that fairly soon, at which point we will have a far better idea of what is actually going to happen than we do at the moment. And it doesn't dovetail particularly well with the suggestions in the government's paper.
I see. Just my final question is to lock my brain in, as it were. There's nothing that means we have to put any changes in ahead of the government guidance, right? The only thing this delaying would do is it would lose us all of the gains that are made in the paper.
Yes.
And then secondly is just to confirm that your professional opinion is that this is the best compromise and list of options that we should be taking based on all of the different things that you've considered and all the questions that we've been asking.
Compromise is the right word for it. It is a compromise. Oh, that's all. Compromise. It is a compromise in terms of what we're trying to achieve, what I've been tasked to do in terms of speeding up the decision-making process, while still allowing the democratic oversight and the call-ins and everything else. I genuinely feel that it's the best option.
Thank you.
Okay, who's next? Councillor Fisher?
Thank you. Looking at the elements that are excluded from consideration, you include full applications as being considered and outline applications. You don't include reserved matters. Now, as my experience, when you've got an outline application, it can be very, very vague. The real nuts and bolts are in the reserved matters application. Could you explain your rationale for excluding reserved matters application? And my second question is, can we take an adjournment, please, as soon as possible? Thank you.
The reason for not bringing reserved matters is that they could still be called in, and if the chair considered that it reasonable, they could still come to committee if there was something that needed considering, if there was obviously significant local objection. But basically, an outline considers the principle. It establishes the principle. Your reserved matters is your technical detail. That's what your planning officers are here to do. That's what we as professionals are. We're your professional people that give the advice, who look at and assess it against planning policies. You've said that the principle is acceptable. The technicalities of it can, in my opinion, can be done. My opinion can be done by officers, but if we think there is a need for if there is some kind of issue with it, if I don't know, numbers or whatever else that we think, it would still come back to committee. It's not saying that reserved matters will never come back to planning committee. It's saying that they don't automatically come to committee, because the amount of time that again would save is significant in the grand scheme of things. So that's why it's been there. It's because the reserved matters are your more technical element. They're assessed against planning policy. It's not establishing the principle, which members would clearly still have an oversight on as part of the outline.
Okay. Take a break then until past.
Side discussion going on. Yeah, so you're aware. He's left us for the evening.
No, that's fine. Don't blame her. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I think hopefully we're on last questions, if there are any. No, I've got a couple. So just in terms of the transition between the current system and the new one, obviously we'll have passed the call-in period for existing applications, and if we move to a system where an application I would have expected to have gone to committee isn't going to now, you know, can we have a system that allows a sort of, you know, a sort of secondary call-in?
We have discussed this and we think that is a reasonable thing to do. Potentially 14 days once we've implemented the new system, that we give members additional 14 days of the consultation period to then ask for a call in, that potentially something that has changed through the would previously have defaulted to go to committee but wouldn't now, so the 14 days to call that to request a call in.
Okay.
That's right. I think I've explained that right, but basically, yes, we have discussed that and agree.
And just to check, it's the intention that we'd be notified that this would have previously gone to committee and then we can call it in, or it's something we have to go and pay attention to and notice ourselves?
Hadn't thought in that level of detail, but I'm sure we can work something out where I don't know how we'll do it, but we'll look and see.
I mean, I guess there's quite a lot of, you know, like Haxby Station, under these proposals, it wouldn't necessarily come to committee. Do I need to call that in? You know, I think that's sort of thing we'd need to.
I think I can safely say that Haxby Station would be coming to planning committee. I can't think that isn't one that where myself or the chair would go that wouldn't need to go to planning committee. That's something that, unless we get no objections and nobody's, you know, and no any interest in it whatsoever, then yeah, that I'm sure we can delegate it. But you get my point there, that it's.
Yeah, but you get my point, which is that seems obvious, but there will be lots of gradations of that all the way. So
There will, but I think there's got to be a level of trust of what we do now in terms of what we ask to come to committee and what we don't ask to come to committee that potentially doesn't need to come, and we do bring that. So I can't sit here and say that every single one, because I don't know what we're going to have in the future, but I think Haxby is a very good example of something that it's not a small project, is it? It would come to planning committee, something such as that.
any other questions? I've got one more somewhere. In terms of speakers then, so one of the issues that we had at the Haxby North application was that the 3 ward councillors couldn't individually speak. When we say pool our time, do you mean pool as in 2 people could have 6 minutes, or do you mean 2 people can have 3 minutes?
This would still be at the chair's discretion, but we would pool it as in 1 ward councillor to have the 3 minutes. That's my understanding, but obviously it's not my decision, it's chair's discretion.
Okay. I think that was sort of widely considered, I think, to be, you know, not really in the best interests of the sort of, you know, progressing that application. So I think if possible.
My interpretation of pooling would be 3 + 3 added together. So you could have, you know, 1 ward councillor that speaks for 1.5 minutes and another speaks for 4.5 minutes, for example. That's how I would view pooling, because that's the plain English use of the phrase. So, you know, if you pool your resources, you get more resources.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that.
We the last committee had a different answer to that question, which was that it is 3 minutes total if everyone agrees. But if you have 2 councillors in favour and 1 speaking against, then they'd have 3 minutes between the 2 and then 3 minutes for the 1. That's what we got told last month, or the month before last. But again, if it's chair's discretion, it kind of doesn't matter what our answer is, because they can choose to do something different anyway, I suppose. Chair
always has discretion when they're running a meeting.
Well, he didn't think he had discretion at Haxby North. Councillor Pavlovich.
Yeah, I think the reason that came in a couple of years ago, if not before, was the anomalous position of an objector, for example, having 3 minutes, and then the applicant bringing 3-4 in, having 3 minutes each. So that's where I think they brought the pooling. I think that's why they said, if you're an applicant, you can have your experts, but you're still only going to get three minutes, because it was disproportionately advantageous to the applicant, as opposed to those objecting.
Yeah, I just think councillors are different, and if any councillor wants to speak, they should be able to. And in terms of call-in, can any councillor call in any application? Or is it just those in that ward?
Just that ward.
I think
It's the same as it is now. That's not intended to change. You can call an application in your ward.
I think that's something that should change, or at least consideration of it, because there will be important citywide applications, that have implications across the city, that if only the members in that particular ward can call in.
That wouldn't be consistent with any of the research I've done with other councils anywhere. It is usually, I mean, if you do research, I imagine you'll find someone somewhere, but from any council I've ever come across, it's only been ward councillors being able to call in applications for their ward. If an application is of such significance, I would imagine that it would come to committee anyway.
Can I ask a question just on that and the general principle of that? If there were a circumstance where people felt that it should be called in but didn't have the power to call it in, presumably they could talk to senior officers, and senior officers could then use discretion to say, yeah, actually, we fully agree with you. Doing something to the station is something that only that particular 3 councillors has impact, even though technically,
Yep. Agreed. Yep.
Okay, I'm out of questions. Anybody else? No. So has anybody got any comments they would like to make before we move to some sort of resolution? Councillor Rose?
Yeah, I'll go through my entire speech I've written for myself. First thing is, I think the two committees merging thing is completely sensible. I know that wasn't shared by public, but I didn't hear any words against that really last time round. There are so many people and cases and substitutes, and then, as I mentioned about the RSPCA, there are lots of individual situations where applications have suffered, and the consequences of those have been significant as a result of the 2 committee systems. So I think that one's perfectly reasonable. I don't think there's any necessary reason to make changes due to the government changing approach at this point. But the reason the government is making those changes is because there have been national reports identifying that changes are needed nationally, and we have separately to that identified a number of changes locally. And we're at odds with the majority of councils on most of these points, which is one of the reasons why those are being changed. So it doesn't make sense to not do anything just because the government's holding off, unless we think they're moving in a different direction to us, which it sounds like is not the case. And then the other bits of those specifics, I think are a matter for debate. And I think it's good to have that discourse and question why these things are included and these things aren't, and what the threshold should be. But if it's been arrived at by experts thinking sensibly that it's the best compromise, and that's their professional opinion, I think that makes sense. I'd suggest we review in a year, have a paper for the estimated time and cost savings, positive, negative impacts, any concerns about either specific bullet points that are missing or ones that are in here, but actually with hindsight, maybe we shouldn't have it in there, and we can make some tweaks a year down the line if a constitutional changes are needed. And then my frustration is we brought this to committee in July, not we, but officers brought it to the committee in July. And then I spent quite a lot of time trying to find a date that we could bring this forward with a special meeting, so that we could in July or the beginning of August have a meeting where we could talk about this and still have time to then bring things back to this committee. with any minor tweaks or any research or checks we want to make. I was greatly assured by everybody at the committee and officers that we could definitely bring it to this meeting because everything will be resolved and it's definitely going to this full council. And so my frustration is with people who have differences of opinions, but the idea of, well, let's delay it anyway, was not what was agreed in July, and I'm slightly frustrated that that's the conversation we're having. And then I guess my final comment in terms of what makes my decision fairly clear is one of the big challenges with planning like licensing is you only really hear those strong negative opinions about things. They're the people who come to talk on topics a lot, but who hasn't come and talked? The Conservatives aren't here raising objections about it. We don't have, the Civic Trust and the other planning bodies who know about this and have talked about it here. The other parish councils didn't raise objections with us formally or make representations today. The one that did only asked about assurances they can still attend and speak at those meetings. So I'm with the people who, in the public who spoke, that when you first hear about, councils making fewer decisions, the knee-jerk reaction is that's less democratic and less effective. And that's what I first thought when I heard about it. And then we spent 3 months talking about it, and it sounds like it makes things more efficient. It sounds like things, it's more effective, it's cost saving, it's faster, it doesn't have any risk attached to it, and it's the expert opinion of our council experts. And I just don't see any reason to delay on the grounds that maybe there'll be a national guidance that might even say exactly what we're doing, but it might say something slightly different that we might be able to change later down the road. Anyway, I can't see any actual real risks here. And that's, where I've ended up from the questions today and validating all of those thoughts, really.
Okay. Councillor Burton.
I haven't asked any questions. I've listened very carefully to all the public participants, and I wrote down the main points that I was worried about. But all the colleagues on both sides of the table have allayed all my fears from everything that I've heard. I've heard Becky Eads talk about, the professional side of this and her professional judgment and why she's come to this. And I respect that. I don't think there's anything sinister behind this, which, you might worry because people that mentioned taking away the democratic process. I don't believe that's going to happen. And if you look at the actual numbers involved of cases that have been recalled, I think they're so small. There's still the option to call in with the discretion of the chair, which there was already. So I all my fears on listening to the public speakers and reading through myself have been allayed, and I feel comfortable, very comfortable with the changes that are proposed.
Okay, Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. In all my time in local government, there's always been one guiding principle by which councils are governed, and that is that officers advise, members decide, officers implement, and members take responsibility. And that is the way councils should be run, because the members are the ones who are responsible to their electorate for decisions, and they're the ones who have to carry the can if they get it wrong. Now, in my view, this is interfering in that position. I have no problems, and I admire the professional knowledge of our planning officers in terms of planning law enormously. But local members know their wards and they know the area very much better than anyone who doesn't live around there or may not have the intimate knowledge of the area. The second point is, why has this been done? I get the impression that this is much more a matter of resources and workload than anything else. We've heard so much about the fact that, it takes so long to bring an application to committee. And I appreciate that. That's put you in a difficult position. And I knew that when I was chair of planning, you were struggling sometimes. The second point it's been brought is to speed up planning so that we get more houses built. Speeding up planning permissions will not introduce another house onto the market, because as I spoke with friends who are in the housing development market, the only thing that determines how fast houses are built is the housing market factors. And that's driven almost entirely by the state of the economy. That's why developers very often get planning permission, then sit on sites for a long while, because it's not economic to develop them. And that is where the whole fundamental argument of the Ministry of Housing and Local Government is flawed because she doesn't understand the housing market. She doesn't understand that basic factor. You think of as many planning applications you like, the number that get houses that get built will be determined by how many people can afford to buy them. Housing developers will not discount. My friend who's done this for 28 years says he's only once discounted houses to actually make them more affordable because there's cash flow crisis and the need to do it. Otherwise, they just say, right, we'll build a few houses, see how they sell. If not, we'll put that site to bed and develop another site that is actually selling. So it's not going to produce this sudden flood of new houses. And that's the problem we face. So as far as I'm concerned, the better metric of planning performance is the quality of the outcomes, the quality of the developments we actually get, how well thought out, how well implemented they are, rather than the speed at which you put them through. And I think we're on the floor ground if we go through with these proposals.
Okay, any further comments? Councillor Whitcroft?
Thank you, Chair. I do appreciate the strength of feeling that this has had. We've had quite a lot of public speakers, which planning always does bring along, particularly more than other areas. Thank you very much, Becky, for this report, and thanks to all your officers who helped. I just wanted to touch really on how planning feels a bit like Schrodinger's cat sometimes, when it is not political. And we are told all the time it's completely apolitical, even though we often sit opposite one another by political groups, and yet the public view it through a political lens all the time. I'm sure it goes out in leaflets about local councillors have done this based on party, when we know that planning is meant to be apolitical, and that's the point of the Act. That's the point of the planning process. I think that having this qualification around members' involvement there will actually be able to show what the Planning Act really is, which is about making sure we apply planning law appropriately and hold things in the balance. Do appreciate the point around how local members do often know their wards really well, but I might be sat here discussing, well, in fact, I have sat here discussed the housing development in Strensall. I don't know Strensall particularly well, and my vote counts the same as yours on the committee. So I appreciate we shouldn't stop having councillors' input, but I think the idea that is reflected on committees isn't quite the case. We also need to know we need to change with the times here. We've got the government legislation going forward and the changes that that's going to make. I think this provides a really good start for us to look at what the government legislation is going to be. As terrifying as the prospect of sort of having a parish council rebellion around Strensall would be, I think we need to be realistic about what the government's powers are. We can't have our own planning policy. We simply have to interpret and apply what the government gives us. The points around democratic oversight, I accept that's a real advantage of having a planning committee. We are still going to have a planning committee. We are not getting rid of either of them. This is a reduction and a combination or an amalgamation of the two. And there's the limited statistics showing that, 19 called in, 3 overturned, and then one of them's gone over on 3 went against the officer recommendation. One of them's gone down on appeal. The others may well as well. We need to think about the cost pressures that we've got here, particularly in the quality that we want to deliver for planning. And we also think we need to think about the pressure on councillors. Now, no one's going to enjoy me talking about the time pressure faced by councillors, but we have a lot of evening meetings. A lot of us work full time during the day and then come in. Planning applications can go on for 5 hours. What was the Outer Ring Road? 6 hours, 6.5. It's a long, long time to be making serious, very important decisions. When it gets to 9 o'clock at night, even some of the most talented and energetic amongst us are probably going to struggle with that. I think reserving that for the most important applications, there's a benefit there. As I've said, we're still going to have that planning committee. The local plan is really important. I often look at things as a councillor that are older than me, but this is the first thing I've seen that's older than my dad, in the sense that we haven't had a planning application for such a long period of time, or local plan for such a long period of time. 13,000 houses we need to deliver. That could very reasonably block up the planning process that we currently have. I think it's important that we streamline it, and that's what these changes put in. I disagree about the idea of planning permission and housing. I've not heard that view before, so I'm interested. But from my point of view, it's basic supply and demand. If building more houses and issuing more planning permission won't reduce the supply of housing, what was the point of the local plan then? What was the point of trying to build more houses? If we're just going to offer the planning permission, then I may have misunderstood you there, councillor. I'm happy to discuss that later. I do worry about this becoming a political debate as well. We've had the power grab allegations. We've had the issues around refighting old battles on planning committees. particularly around public participation and the role that that plays. It's important, but most applications don't even get 3 on either side. You'd be lucky to get 2 or 3 in a lot of them. So I think it's fair enough with those limitations. Councillor Merritt has said it best. We have a duty to manage a well-run local authority with an efficient planning process. I think that's what these changes are going to achieve. So I'm in favour.
Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. We discussed this matter at some length against a background of having a nation with something in the region of 1 million plus extant planning permissions which have not been developed. And before I came back onto the council for 10 or so years, I chaired a 106 liaison committee at Germany Beck. Now, the Germany Beck application, which was approved about 10 years ago, was for 700 houses. And by the time I tendered my resignation, less than 300 had been built. It is economic drivers which dictate the pace of build, plus the availability of skilled tradespeople to actually build the houses. That's not to say we shouldn't process applications in a timely manner. I'm all in favour of that, and I'm sure we will continue to do so, whoever is running the council as the years go by. What I do find curious is that government is saying they're going to change the rules. I'm not sure if Councillor Rose meant to say it, but he implied that it may be that the government would be coming up with a structure of delegation. I suspect it is going to happen. I suspect it will happen in the very near future, and I don't see the logic of trying to do a change now, where in a few months we will be coming back and doing further changes. And as Chair has already indicated, the consultation process closed some time back. So we should be seeing what the government mandate is going to be in the near future. Just sort of picking up on the theme of Councillor Fisher, and which has been echoed repeatedly, this is a loss of democratic decision making. It has surprised me the number of people who've stopped me in the streets to talk about this, who've sent me emails, etc. It is something which is going to be very unpopular. Just looking at detail, I'm still concerned as to the vagueness in respect of what's going to happen to non-residential proposals. I don't see that they have been adequately dealt with. I was singularly impressed by a number, well, all of the speakers, some of whom have a vast experience of planning. Former Councillor de Gorn served for 20 years on the planning committees, and Councillor Vassy has many years' experience. He touched on One Museum Street and Oglethorpe. I think, to be blunt, I've got to say officers got that wrong, and the committee corrected it. I'm pretty damn sure that if that had been left to an officer delegation, those applications would have gone on appeal. Appeals take up a huge amount of officer time, and they are very expensive. And that, of course, is one of the risks which engage once we're in the situation of a significant increase in delegation. Public participation at planning meetings. I can't get my head round the amount of time which is being spent over this. If we allow one person to speak, it is 3 minutes. If we allow 10 people to speak, it is 30 minutes. We're talking about 27 minutes. And I think in terms of the big applications, I think of Campus East, the biggest application York has ever had, 275 acres. Are we really going to apply these sort of what I'll call petty rules when it comes to speakers in those circumstances? It's bonkers. And I do place on record what happened over ST9. I think that was an unacceptable position to reduce 3 ward councillors to 3 minutes presentation to committee. Transitional arrangements, if this matter were to go ahead, it is very important that nobody loses out because matters were not called in the expectation that an application was going to go to committee. That flies in the face of natural justice. And my final observation, and it is an observation, it seems to me, having sat on planning committees going back over a period of nearly 40 years. I was a very young councillor in those days, I assure you. That this council needs to take a much slicker approach in its committee operation. And I think that applies both on the member side and also on the officer side. And with that, significant time saving, the ability to process through committee a far greater caseload will occur. And those are my conclusions, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Rose.
Yeah, just to respond to a few of the perfectly sensible points that have been made. On the point of officers advising councillors aside, which is a principle we all agree with, if that's a universal stance, then we breach it 96% of the time here, and it's breached every time there's a decision made by an officer we can't involve ourselves in. So, you know, personal support for complex needs situations, those are always officers decide, not just officers advise. I do take the point that the planning market plays a huge part in whether houses get built or not, but it isn't just the planning market. You know, especially if we're responsible for things like delays, but York Central's being built, other large sites being built, particularly things that the council is doing. There are some that are paused, and it's partly because people get planning permission and then they try and sell the land and permission on, and all sorts of other reasons. But there are these tiny developments of 3 houses at a time dotted about that get built all times in weak markets as much as strong markets. On the national scheme of delegation point, I guess what I was trying to say in a roundabout way was I don't care about what they're doing nationally, as long as we're not at odds with it. If we're doing something and it turns out what a colossal waste of time, it's the opposite of what we're allowed to do and we have to fix everything, that's a problem. Other than that, they'll do what they want to do in the time they'll do it. That applies to a whole bunch of, you know, different things going on at the moment with potential impact on councils, tourist tax, Airbnb legislation, whatever. We can plan around it, but we don't know when they're going to do it and what they're going to do. So let's crack on with what we think is the right thing to do. And I guess the last point is I do respect all of the speakers a lot, and they made some very good points and gave some great speeches. And I did then follow up with questions to understand the key points they're making and validate it. But just to pick one example, you mentioned Andy Dugan. He has a lot of experience. He was talking about perceptions of a council that doesn't listen, and I would argue that that's kind of his name synonymously in the city. And that as much as these people are experts, as much as other people here are experts, we've heard from people, you know, outside of this meeting as well, I'm sure all of us, you know, our job is still to validate those points, which is what we've been doing. And another example is Kevin spoke very, very well, but it isn't a committee decision now as to whether this happens or not. You know, our job, it's a council decision. Our job is basically to decide to endorse it or not, or even to oppose it when it comes to full council. You know, it's not our decision to make. The only thing we'll know about whether this has had the effects desired or not is when we see the proof in the pudding. And that's why I still think it makes sense to bring it back in a year, review it. We can make changes, we can add things, we can remove things. But in the meantime, we still have all the call-ins. You know, we still have senior officers being able to bring things just off personal judgments. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think the risks are high at all, but the potential benefits are huge. And if it turns out we've got a year of not great planning, we can fix it all, or even if we'd have to wait a year if we identify immediate problems. But based on everything I've heard, I can't see why we would be in a situation where things are vastly different to today, to be honest.
Councillor Merritt.
Thank you, Chair. Jason's said a number of things I was going to, but I'd just like to say something else. You know, I've been around a rather long time too, and involved, as Richard said, in planning going back quite a long way. And the reality in terms of the sort of officers advise, members decide in planning has radically changed in that time. You know, when I was first on planning committees, members had a large scope for discretion. That has gone. Successive governments have changed the rules, changed the approach, made it much tighter over the years. And members' discretion now is really to be focused at strategic level through the production of local plans. In effect, what they've tried to do is that the actual planning application, development control process, has, you know, they've tried to depoliticize it, professionalize it against a clear planning framework and a clear local plan. And that's what we now have to live with. So the reality is, you know, I've watched since I've come back on the council what happens at those planning committees. And we're often in the situation where you know, that 5 hours is accommodated by members asking questions about, you know, when they've got residents behind them who dislike an application, asking questions on every last dot and comma, trying to find something that they can use as an argument. But actually, when it comes to the planning and having to judge things against the actual planning rules, most of those arguments don't stack up, and you end up perhaps with one tweak, minor tweak to a condition, and an informative to cover some of the issues that you can't put in as a condition because there's no actual planning basis for it. Is that a good use of time? Our time? Officer time? No, it's not. We actually need to change that, and members need to stop that abuse of the system. I admit I have been guilty of it myself on occasion, but that's why we waste so much time and take so much time with, you know, individual items on planning committees, and therefore don't process anywhere near as much. And you know, it's our local council taxpayers who are paying for that indulgence in terms of all the costs of the planning process as we currently have it, and are paying for it in terms of the consequential delays to other applications being processed. So, you know, things need to change. We need to be more honest about the very limited member discretion in actual development control. You know, Councillor Fisher made absolutely the right point about quality. Yes, quality is important, but you should have got that right in the local plan sections on design. That was actually members' opportunity to set the right bars and to set the right frame. And I have to say, unfortunately, in your plan, you didn't particularly do that. And you know, we are where we are. I think I think if you listen carefully to what Becky was saying, it is very clear, very careful thought has gone into achieving the balance of the changes in the delegation scheme that will allow us to have less items that are relative formalities. There remains the planning the head planning officer's discretion and the planning committee chair and vice chair's discretion to make sure that we do see those applications where there's genuine public concern, a real planning issue at debate, and not to be caught in the position where we're having a planning application called in simply because a member wants to appease local residents when there's no good planning grounds for that call in. You know, we've been our own worst enemies, and that's why change is required. So I am fully in support of the changes that are proposed. We need to get on with it. You know, we are short of resources. Yes, you're right in the sense it's a matter of choice on resources, but we know our financial position is not getting any easier. We're not going to be able to recruit lots of extra planning officers to indulge ourselves. And you know, we need to get on, make the necessary changes to make this system better for applicants, for local residents who want to alter their houses and so on, and to be more efficient and cost effective for our council taxpayers.
Thank you. Councillor Burton, did you have a final word?
Very briefly, I promise. I totally agree with what Councillor Merritt's just said. And going back to what Councillor Fisher said, officers advise and members decide. Officers have advised us that this is a good way forward, and we are deciding on that. So I think we have to think about that too. It's not just on the planning decisions in each planning decision. It's a way forward now. Maybe, as Councillor Rose has suggested, we look again in a year's time to see how this is working, as we're doing with the Scrutiny Committee changes. If it's not working, then look at it again. But officers have advised us. We've gone to them, asked them for their advice, and we're deciding.
Okay, I think Councillor Pavlovich, you wanted very, very briefly.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I'm more than happy to accept the review in a year's time paper to see how it's gone, and the transitional arrangements that aren't in the paper but have been asked for, to accept that those go forward to full council for its consideration.
Okay, thank you. I'll just give my brief thoughts then, and they are scribbled down on paper, so you'll have to forgive me. So I think I've got three main concerns: the why now question, the issue with the proposals themselves, and then I think as well a big issue with the perception of the changes to the public. So in terms of the why now, we know we've got a government review. We know it is going to produce a national scheme of delegation that we will have to implement. And I'm afraid the proposals here do not accord with the suggestions that are in the paper at the moment. The government is talking about a tiering system. It's talking about different thresholds of houses. It's talking about commercial industrial development, which we don't. It's talking about different types of application being delegated to the ones we are. We have gone way beyond what the government is even suggesting at the moment. So the idea that we're kind of just aligning ourselves with what might come down the track from the government is way off course. We are going to have to wholesale review these changes as soon as the government produces its national scheme of delegation. And that's just the way it is, I'm afraid. We are miles apart at the moment, I think. But I think that's just my opinion, but I think it's pretty clear to me. In terms of the changes themselves, so I mean, ultimately, we're on a kind of spectrum where we're sort of tuning the democratic input from members of the public and from councillors against the time taken and the delay to the system due to that input. And I think ultimately it's predicated on a completely upside down to me understanding of the way and the value of the sort of democratic involvement in the planning system. We're looking at it as a problem. We're looking at it as slowing things down, as delay, as causing issues. We're not looking at it as I think we should do, that the sort of democratic involvement of the public and of councillors improves planning applications. It makes them better because local people know their areas best. It also helps get planning applications through because where people are part of the process and where they can see what's happening and where they feel like their voice is being heard, they are far more likely to support those applications. So I think these changes ultimately will prove entirely counterproductive if the aim is to try and get through more housing development. What we're going to end up doing is causing more strife in local communities who feel that their voices aren't being heard, and we're going to see more and more direct action of the sorts we've been seeing where people feel that they have to take things more into their own hands. So I do have real concerns about the continuing erosion of the sort of democratic input in the system. I think as well, as has been pointed out, the page we've got is, I guess necessarily brief, but it leaves so many unanswered questions. I appreciate that there's an argument that the chief planner, the chair of the committee will, decide, I guess, behind closed doors, which applications go to committee and which don't. But it is going to be really difficult for us as councillors when we see an application in the first 2 weeks, when we have our opportunity for a call in, we're going to be constantly going to the chief planner and the chair of the committee and saying, is this likely to go to committee? Because without that sort of guidance, we're really going to struggle to understand where exactly, at the moment it's fairly clear, we know what's going, we know whether we need to submit a call in. Haxby Station, I still don't know whether I need to or not. I've been told it's very likely to go to committee, but also it might not. If there's no comments, So we're going to be constantly going and asking that question. And I think it puts an incredible amount of pressure on the chair of the committee and the chief planner to be making those sorts of decisions. And far from reducing the political involvement, it's going to increase it, because it's going to be far easier for members of the council to put in a call-in request, and when it's turned down by the chair or the chief planner, to say they won't let you have your say. That's going to make it worse, not better. Yeah, finally, just on the public trust, we know that public trust in the planning system is, at a rock bottom level already. The government reviews have found that trust, it's been constantly declining, and that's partly because of that element of people feeling marginalised in the system, and that's just going to continue and continue, and public involvement, public trust in the system is going to worsen, and I think we need to, be really careful about that. I think that's probably all I'll say. Most of my issues have been covered. Gone very briefly, because I do want to wrap this up. Councillor Rose.
Mine was just, obviously there's different opinions around the table and some of the things have been said, but I just want to check if either Michael or Becky think that any of us have a fundamental misunderstanding of anything, or if we've got the facts and we've interpreted it differently, or we have different opinions. But is there anything that one or multiple of us are just categorically not understanding? Or good, thank you.
Yes, I was going to move the recommendations with the additional of Jason's suggestion of a 12-month review and the alterations that were outlined by the exec member and Becky. I'll just make one final comment on what you said, Chair. Yes, people's belief in the planning system has changed, because the planning system has changed, and that changed. The biggest change was the introduction of the presumption in favour of development in the 2012 National Planning Policy Framework, introduced by the Conservative Lib Dem coalition government. So look to yourselves.
I'm not sure that's an argument to make things worse. Right, so I think we were all happy with the contract procedure rules. So I'm taking it we can sort of park that aspect of the paper to one side. We've then had a proposal to approve the planning committee arrangements. Presumably somebody will second. Councillor Whitcroft. Okay, so if we take a vote then on that, so all those in favour? Okay, all those against? Okay, so that's 4-3. Okay, right, thank you very much. Sort of as predetermined as one of your planning applications, I think. Okay, we move on then to item 8, which is the executive scrutiny protocol.
Thank you, Chair. Very quick update for members. Obviously, following the changes to Scrutiny Committee, there's been some work done by the Principal Committee in relation to how it interacts with executive. As a result of that, you have a document which talks about the protocol for how those operations come together. That's included here for members' views. This is something that the main Scrutiny Committee is happy with, and therefore it's something that they are commending to us as something to be introduced.
Okay, any questions, issues? Councillor
No, not really question issues, just I think they're great principles. I think it's well written, but it heavily relies on goodwill, things like clarity on the forward plan, and enough time for pre-scrutiny, and they're all quite challenging. So I look forward to reading the first annual report on how well it's gone. But I guess also, as with the item that's just gone, there is often an appearance in scrutiny as there is in other meetings of partisanship or political party alignment, and it's just different perspectives on things or different alignments. So again, hopefully this helps to iron out some of that and create some more cross-party consensus and take away any of that appearance of politics where there isn't politics, etc. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Councillor Burton.
I must declare an interest because I was on the committee. Sorry, that as was Councillor Merritt, that put together this, and it was a cross-party committee, and I think we've worked very closely together and worked well. And I think, you know, some of us were more sceptical than others about how it would work, but we've decided to give it a try with the proviso that we'll look again. And we are very much in the early stages of this still. With our committees, but we are trying our best. I'm also a committee chair to work cross-party wise with colleagues to ensure that we're covering things in scrutiny and being fair to the topics that we're covering. So I think I'm fine with this, and I can commend the colleagues who were not of my party who mainly wrote this and wrote it up, and were very open to suggestions in the writing of it. So I think it's so far so good, I'd say.
Okay. Any further questions, issues? No. I think the only thing I'd note is the executive scrutiny protocol and relationship really does rely on the executive being willing to sort of give up an element of control and to, listen to those voices outside of it. And I think, that has been an issue going all the way back, is that it's always difficult for, the executive to have those sorts of conversations, because there's always the worry of being painted as, not knowing what you're doing or making mistakes or changing your mind. And I think that's the issue and sort of hump that needs to be gotten over, really. And see how it works. But Councillor Merritt?
I take the point in principle, but I would make the point, the chair of the scrutiny, Councillor, your colleague, Councillor Fenton, and myself met the leader and deputy leader of the council. And, we had at least the current ones, and I think, we had a good discussion and we got the commitment to trying to make this work, which I think was reasonably genuinely given. And, compared with what's gone on in the past, if you actually look at attendance at scrutiny, we have had very, very good attendance by executive members under the current administration. And, the current executive members asking for pre-scrutiny on a reasonable number of items. So I'm sure we're not perfect, but I think there is a genuine attempt going on at the moment to try and make this work in a way that it didn't before, in response to the peer review. So let's see how it works.
Yeah. Okay, so I assume we're all happy with it. Yeah. Okay. Move on then to item 9, which is the work plan. Any questions, issues, Councillor Rose?
I personally think it's been fairly clear that we have suffered from a lack of an independent member at this meeting and at other meetings in the last year. It is surprising to me that the update on the recruitment is the process is so slow that we're going to wait all the way until next calendar year rather than November. And I know that that's based on however many months we've had of the process so far, but if we had 2 independent, there's no shade, by the way, on the independent member who can't be here today, but if we have 2, it reduces the risk of that failure. And I just wonder if there's any way we can bring it forward, but also, what else can we do, either as people in this committee or as individual councils or whatever. I reckon I could go and fill that in a week myself from just going on LinkedIn, all the people that I know personally. I'm not doing that because it's an independent member. That'd be a terrible idea. But I don't understand exactly what the difficulties are. And so hearing that in November, if we're still having challenges, or hopefully we've got some progress on that process, I just wanted to get the understanding of why it's January, not November.
I can happily give you a very brief update, which is we put the application out and got no suitable applicants. So if you see this sort of thing out, by all means, share it on LinkedIn amongst everyone you know.
But if we had a vacancy in another role, we'd be going out and using our other partners for recruitment and stuff, right? We're not doing as much as we would do with an empty director role, for example. So there must be more we can push for.
There probably is. I think if I were to be brutally honest, if I could clone myself, then I would have sufficient time to deal with it, as well as everything else. The problem I've suffered with is two senior members of staff who've been promoted elsewhere. And that rather hampers dealing with that, as well as all of the other things that I've got ongoing. And unfortunately, I've got to prioritise. And whilst I appreciate that having independent members is exceptionally helpful, dealing with the Local Government Boundary Commission review is somewhat more pressing for me at the moment, for example. We have a new head of Democratic starting in, I'm going to say, a week and a half, 15th of September. Once she arrives, some of that capacity comes back into the system, and we can look to push it on.
Okay. So you're saying that January is kind of the point at which we think we can be thinking about this again, or?
I would hope that by January we'll be coming back and explaining not only where we've got with the process, but hopefully the person that we've appointed, assuming we get suitable applicants. So perhaps what I will commit to is, when we get to the point of re-advertising, we will share a copy of that advert with all members of the committee. And if you know people in the community who fulfill the criteria, please share it with them. And we're happy to take anyone who's suitable to come in and sit in that role.
We press release it, presumably. That we're looking.
Yeah, we can do. I think that we don't tend to do press releases for vacancies unless it's things like the chief executive. But at this stage, we will take any steps we can.
Okay. Other issues? No.
The only thing to add for me, of course, is that on the upcoming items, I would suggest that for probably November 26th, then we add in review of planning committee arrangements. Because assuming we take it to council in September, it's going to be late September, early October before it actually takes effect. We'll then have a 12-month period to see how it's working, and then we'll have a few weeks to pull the data together and bring it to you, if that works for members.
Yeah. Is it best coming to Audit and Governance or place? Okay. Okay, we're all happy. I'll close the meeting there. Thank you.
Thank you.